You are standing, imaginarily of course, on the banks of the Upper Zab River, sometime around 870 BCE. The sun bakes the dust into the kind of fine powder that sticks between your toes, even through thick sandals. You've traveled from the city of Kalhu, modern-day Nimrud, nestled along the Tigris, to the start of something that, to modern eyes, might look unremarkable, a long trench-like canal cut with steady precision across the land. But to Ashurnazirpal II, king of Assyria and self-proclaimed terror of the gods' enemies, this was no mere trench. This was one of his greatest legacies. Ashurnazirpal II ruled the Neo-Assyrian Empire during a time when control over water, its flow, its storage, and its symbolism was as important as control over armies. Unlike kings who built towers, palaces, or pyramids, Ashurnazirpal fancied himself a hydraulic mastermind. He wanted his capital city of Kalhu not just supplied with water, but with water that obeyed his will. To understand his motivation, you must first understand the environment. Northern Mesopotamia was blessed and cursed in equal measure. The rivers were life-giving, yes, but they were also moody. They could vanish or swell with little warning, ruining crops and washing away fragile mud-brick homes. So, managing these rivers wasn't just smart, it was survival. And for a king eager to portray himself as both divine and practical, water offered a perfect canvas. The canal project wasn't a whim. Ashurnazirpal II employed thousands of laborers, many of them prisoners of war from recently conquered regions. They cut into the dry soil, moving rock and dirt with bronze tools under the scorching sun. These were not canals for leisure. They were long, sloped channels designed to harness the exact gradient needed to keep water flowing without stagnation or overflow. Every curve was calculated, every sluice gate positioned with intent, and the king wanted everyone to know it. He recorded his achievements not in soft-spoken humility, but in gloriously repetitive inscriptions carved into stone slabs and palace walls. One such inscription boasts, "I dug a canal from the Upper Zab River. I called it the Pati Hegali Canal. I led water into the city of Kalhu for the people to drink and the gods to bathe." That last part, about the gods, is a telling one. Water wasn't just for crops or cleaning, it was sacred, and if the gods bathed in it, well, then surely it must be clean enough for royal use. Interestingly, many of these inscriptions are nearly identical. Scholars today suspect that teams of scribes had a standard boilerplate for canal success, and the king had them copied like ancient bureaucratic templates. These repetitions, while perhaps boring to modern readers, were meaningful. As this quiet tale winds down, tell me, where in the world are you watching from tonight? A cold village? A quiet city? Somewhere with rain? I read every one of your stories, and they're part of the sleep ritual now. The canal served practical ends too. Kalhu became a lush, well-supplied urban hub. The water supported date palms, barley fields, and more curiously, royal gardens filled with foreign trees and plants imported from across the empire. These gardens weren't for picnics, they were propaganda. Imagine walking through a lush grove in dry northern Iraq and seeing cedar trees from Lebanon, almond trees from the Zagros Mountains, and exotic flora meant to whisper, "The world obeys me." But canals weren't just about beauty or irrigation. They also helped manage Assyria's most valuable but unpredictable natural resource, its rivers. Each year, seasonal rains threatened to flood the Tigris. By controlling feeder streams with carefully placed canals, Ashurnazirpal's engineers created a buffer system, like a nervous system for the land, that redistributed water and reduced flood risks. It wasn't perfect. Sometimes it failed. But often, it worked. And when it didn't, the king had a plan for that too. Blame the gods, perform a ritual, and build another canal. It's easy to forget, amid the dust of antiquity, that these projects were intensely human. Laborers worked in teams, likely coordinated by overseers with clay tablets, perhaps sweating through linen tunics as they hauled rocks from riverbeds. There may have been breaks for lentil porridge or water scooped from animal skin flasks. There were likely grumbles, perhaps jokes about the king's obsession with ditches. We'll never know their names, but their work carved into the land a system that outlived many dynasties. One curious discovery: in 1951, archaeologists uncovered a large stone canal marker, known as a stela, bearing Ashur-nasirpal's now familiar boastings. But on the back, a scribble by a later ruler attempting to claim credit for the same canal. Even in antiquity, infrastructure theft was a thing. By the end of his reign, Ashur-nasirpal had constructed dozens of canals, aqueducts, and reservoirs. Kalhu thrived not because of conquest alone, but because water flowed where it was needed, when it was needed. His vision of the city as a center of divine and earthly order depended as much on water as it did on walls. But how much of this was really his doing? Was the king truly the engineer he claimed to be, or simply the beneficiary of scribes and planners whose names were lost to time? And what exactly was the Patiha Canal's fatal flaw, as recorded, briefly and sheepishly, by his grandson, Adad-nirari III, decades later?
When he last left you, you were standing beside the banks of a canal, commissioned by Ashur-nasirpal II, a long, dusty ribbon of controlled water carved into the earth with royal pride and scribal repetition. But a canal, you see, is not just a ditch. And this section of our story leads you deeper, down into the geometry of empire, the quiet calculations of ancient engineers, and the gentle persistence of scribes who wrote about water as if it were a deity in need of constant persuasion. Let us begin with a question that might have plagued more than one bronze-wielding overseer. How do you get water to flow at just the right pace when your tools are sticks, stones, and rough measuring cords? The answer lies in what we could call Assyria's sloping wisdom. Engineers of the Neo-Assyrian Empire weren't formally trained in the modern sense. There were no universities or hydrological models, but they did have scribal schools, observational precision, and centuries of trial-and-error techniques passed down on clay tablets. These canal builders understood that a slope too steep would tear away the banks, too flat and the water would stagnate or fail to move at all. What they aimed for, consistently and almost mystically, was a drop of about 1 meter for every kilometer. That might not seem dramatic, but to sustain that rate across tens of kilometers without modern surveying tools, remarkable. How did they do it? With tools as modest as plumb bobs, weighted cords, and water itself. There's evidence that Assyrian engineers used standing pools to observe levelness and placed small stone markers to track elevation. These markers, often inscribed with simple cuneiform symbols, were likely checked by officials called Tupsharu Shanaru, scribes of the canal, whose job was part record-keeping, part engineering, and part spiritual insurance policy. And it's those scribes we must now turn to, for they form the hidden spine of Ashur-nasirpal's hydraulic empire. The Tupsharu, as they were commonly known, were not just passive observers. They were the interpreters of omens, readers of slope tablets, and maintainers of royal glory. One preserved tablet from Kalhu lists no fewer than 87 canal-related incidents in a single season: blockages, silting, theft of water by neighboring farmers, and once, a small child falling in, rescued with no injuries, though this was annotated in oddly poetic Akkadian. These records were not idle bureaucratic flourishes. They were performance reviews of nature itself. By the midpoint of Ashur-nasirpal's reign, canal building had become not just infrastructure,
It was statecraft. He issued edicts that canal maintenance be conducted as part of annual temple duties. This meant that priests, too, became minor hydraulic bureaucrats. The gods, one might say, became part-time ditch inspectors. Meanwhile, inside Kalhu, the water flowed. First to the palace gardens, where decorative ponds held lotus plants and swimming fish imported from the upper Zab. Then into the public fountains, stone basins that women filled jars from in the early morning, gossiping quietly while balancing them on their hips. Finally, the canal watered the royal barley fields on the city's edge, grain not for peasants, but for temple offerings and official rations. At night, the water still trickled gently, guided by narrow gates and sunken channels. Somewhere a boy might have leaned over the edge and watched fish drift past in the torchlight. Somewhere else a scribe sat in his quarters reviewing complaints written by citizens. Water came too late, neighbor blocked the gate, goats drank the overflow again. And all of this, curiously, was political. For Ashur-nasir-pal II, the smooth flow of canal water represented more than engineering prowess. It was evidence of divine favor. When water obeyed, so too, he hoped, would his subjects. But there was a problem beginning to stir, and it wasn't a flood.
Archaeological records suggest that in the latter part of his reign, the Patti-Hagali Canal began to silt, not dramatically, just enough to slow the current, strain the flow, and caused minor disputes downstream. There is no inscription describing this, of course. Kings did not etch their failures into basalt, but we know it happened because his grandson, Adad-nirari III, quietly ordered a resurvey of the Patti-Hagali Canal complex and re-diverted a section of its flow back toward the old course of the Tigris. In a particularly telling tablet fragment, we find a scribe from Adad-nirari's court noting, "The silt has grown like a lazy ox at the banks. The king commands a straightening, but the reeds have their own mind." It is a poetic line and a quiet admission of what ancient rulers rarely voiced, that nature, in the end, does not always obey. And yet, even as the canal began to misbehave, its legacy endured. School tablets from the region show that generations of scribes continued to copy Ashur-nasir-pal's canal inscriptions long after the canal itself had lost its full usefulness. It became mythologized, a story told to demonstrate what kings should do, even if reality had drifted slowly back to the river. So we are left with a question, a gentle one, but persistent. Was Ashur-nasir-pal II a visionary planner who shaped the land, or simply the first to write good PR for his ditches? And if the canals eventually failed, does that diminish their beauty or deepen it? By the time Ashur-nasir-pal II's body was laid to rest, likely in a stone-lined tomb beneath the palace in Kalhu, the Patti-Hagali Canal was already beginning to quiet. The silt moved in slowly, as silt always does, and the stone markers he directed to trumpet his achievement stood half-buried in dry grass and bird droppings. But the story of the canal, like the water it once carried, continued to travel. Through scribal tradition, urban memory, and a faint, lingering sense that this stretch of engineered earth had once meant something profound. In this final chapter, we look not at what Ashur-nasir-pal built, but at what his canal left behind. After his death, the royal city of Kalhu remained the Assyrian capital for roughly a century, thriving on its foundations of planned streets, thick-walled palaces, and hydraulic design. The canal system endured through the reigns of his son and grandson, albeit with repairs and diversions, and curiously, as the direct usefulness of some canal segments waned, their cultural value only seemed to grow. Consider the royal inscriptions of later kings, Tiglath-Pileser III, Esarhaddon, even Sennacherib, who famously built his own aqueducts from the mountains. They all mention Ashur-nasirpal's waterworks, though sometimes with a note of correction, as if to gently one-up their predecessor. I rebuilt the canal of Ashur-nasirpal, one boasts. I improved it with stone lining, says another. This was a royal tradition in itself, to inherit not just land and subjects, but infrastructure, and to claim credit for its upkeep, even when that upkeep was mostly symbolic. Meanwhile, out in the countryside, the canal did what all old waterworks do. It merged into the fabric of everyday life. Farmers dug small offshoot ditches by hand, sometimes with no knowledge of the original builder. Children bathed in its shaded pockets. Reeds grew along its sides, cut for baskets and thatching, and when it dried up in some stretches, it became a footpath. It is not hard to imagine a traveler, many decades after Ashur-nasirpal's time, walking the length of that canal and wondering, who made this, without ever finding an answer. In the ruins of Kalhu today, archaeologists have uncovered not just the canal remains, but also curious objects found near its banks. One was a stone weight used for measuring flow gates. Another, a half-finished clay tablet listing barley distributions that depended on irrigation timing. And most oddly, a tiny carved lion, no more than an inch across, found near a channel outlet. Perhaps it belonged to a child. Perhaps. What's fascinating is that Ashur-nasirpal's greatest infrastructure project eventually stopped being his. That's what happens with water. It belongs to whoever uses it, drinks it, diverts it for their goats, or their dates, or their early morning reed gathering. A king can start a canal, but once it flows, it escapes ownership. But still, the king had left his name. In over a dozen locations, carved stelae, some broken, some whole, stood beside the canal route, each repeating a similar line. Ashur-nasirpal, king of the world, led water to the city of Kalhu. The phrase, so proud, so fixed in its rhythm, echoed not just political power, but a kind of personal reassurance. To the king and to those who read it centuries later, this was a way of saying, I mattered. My hands shaped the land. And perhaps they did. The idea that a canal could outlive its usefulness but not its story tells us something about ancient infrastructure. These were not just state projects. They were dreams in mud and gravity. They connected mountains to cities, rivers to orchards, rain to barley. They required faith, not in gods alone, but in the ability of humans to shape, however briefly, a predictable world. But here's where the story becomes quietly beautiful. In 1989, a team of Iraqi archaeologists uncovered a dry trench near the ruins of Kalhu that matched the rough dimensions of the Pati-Hegali Canal. It was mostly filled in with sediment. No water had run through it in over 2,000 years, but the channel was still visible from above, a ghost cut into the land, faint but unmistakable. Alongside it, embedded in the soil, they found a fragment of limestone with the now familiar words, "The king caused water to come where none had flowed." And maybe, in the end, that's all any ruler can hope to be remembered for. Not for battles won or temples built, but for coaxing a little water through the desert and leaving just enough evidence behind for someone, centuries later, to wonder. So next time you see a ditch lined with grass, half forgotten, or oddly straight across a field, Think of Ashur-Nasirpal II, a man who believed the flow of water was proof of civilization, who carved his achievements into stone only for them to be buried by time, and who, in trying to control nature, became part of it. Was he a genius, or merely persistent? And in the end, does the water even care? Close your eyes, if you like, and imagine the smell of dust. Not unpleasant, just ever present, clinging to your hair, your cloak, the hems of your sandals. The year is somewhere around 480 BCE, and you are standing on a long, sun-bleached track stretching east to west as far as the eye can see. This is not a trade route. It is not a battlefield. It is something older and more quietly powerful, a royal road. The Persians called it Partasha, and the Greeks later translated it more grandly as the royal road of the great king. But for the men who ran along it, literally ran, with wax-sealed messages slapping against their chests, it was simply the way through the world. This story is about those runners and the astonishingly efficient postal system of the Achaemenid Empire, a system that was, in many ways, boring, spectacularly boring. It required no invention, no conquest, no new gods. Just a network of mud brick relay stations, identical uniforms, and the unglamorous stamina of men who did not stop running. The system was likely developed under Cyrus the Great, but it reached full speed under Darius I, the so-called organizer of the empire. He wasn't known for drama. Darius was the kind of ruler who created accounting departments, tax registries, and road signage. And among his most meticulous innovations was a courier service that stretched across more than 1,500 miles of empire, from Sardis in western Anatolia all the way to Susa in the Elamite heartland. It worked like this. Every 15 to 20 miles, there was a posting station, Piradasish in Old Persian, which literally meant place of the message bearer. These were small compounds with fresh horses, clean drinking water, bread, and, most importantly, copies of the king's seal. Couriers would run or ride full speed between them, hand off the message baton, often a thin leather pouch sealed with clay, and the next runner would set off instantly. The message never rested, even if the messenger did. Herodotus, writing about this system with open admiration, noted, "Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds." Yes, the U.S. Postal Service borrowed that line much, much later. But who were these couriers? Surviving fragments from Persepolis archives tell us they were often conscripted workers, sometimes volunteers, occasionally soldiers being punished or tested. They were called angaraios by the Greeks, message men. Most were young, lean, and trained from childhood in distance running. Some ran barefoot. Others wore simple sandals of woven reeds. All carried a small identifying badge that let them pass through checkpoints without being searched. And though their task might sound straightforward, it was anything but restful. Every courier was bound by a sacred rule. If the message failed to arrive within the time allotted,
The runner would be flogged. If it was lost, he could be executed. The roads were not just communication lines. They were arteries of imperial control. Through them flowed tax orders, court summons, provincial news, requests for grain, and occasional notes of personal affection between distant relatives of the king. There were no stamps, no addresses, just routes and timing. Some stations had water clocks to time arrivals. Others recorded the names of couriers in clay logs, updated each day. These logs were kept by elderly scribes who had once been couriers themselves, now slowed by age, but revered for their memory of the roads. One recovered tablet simply says, "Horse did not arrive. Next man sent on foot. 2 hours lost. Message unclear. Copy kept." It's not glamorous history. It's not even particularly suspenseful. But it's the kind of history that built empires and held them together. And let's pause for a moment here on one specific detail. The runners ran at night. Yes, night running was common, especially during the hot months. Moonlight was enough. And because the Royal Road had guide stones every 100 paces, white painted and rubbed with oil by a specialized class of stone cleaners, runners could follow them even in pitch dark. They did not carry torches. Fire was too slow. The darkness was their ally.
Some runners developed an uncanny sense of timing, claiming they could tell the hour simply by the feel of the air on their skin. One such courier, remembered in a fragmentary Persian folk song, was known as Bird Ear because he could estimate distance by how the sound of cicadas changed with altitude. Is that apocryphal? Probably. But it's the sort of detail people remembered because it made a very boring job sound a little heroic. And there's more. Some relay stations doubled as listening posts. The scribes there recorded not just deliveries, but rumors, revolt in Bactria, unusual gathering of merchants in Sardis. These were passed on in separate messages to imperial advisors. In a way, the postal system was also an intelligence network, or perhaps we should say, a gossip route in official disguise. By the time you finished a full run, from one end of the empire to the other, it took 9 days. No single courier ever did it all. But the message did. The message flew. And here we pause, at a quiet way station just outside Arbela, a low mud brick hut with a single oil lamp, a tired scribe, and a small clay tablet recording the arrival of a courier named Artazus. The entry reads, "He arrived. He did not speak. He drank water." The message continued. And with that, we end our first section on the Royal Road, a network that was quite possibly one of the greatest logistical achievements in human history, crafted not by heroes or warriors, but by runners who rarely said a word. But the story of Persia's roads doesn't end here. In the next section, we'll follow a lost courier's route, one that vanished in the Zagros Mountains, along with a pouch containing a message so urgent that a minor war may have been fought because it never arrived. The message was written on cheap clay and sealed with a simple thumbprint. But it found its way, somehow, into the main record of the road officials. For the next several weeks, unusual activity was recorded at the Shahyar post. Extra runners dispatched, a scribal investigation sent from Susa, and even, most unusual of all, a detachment of 10 horsemen assigned to retrace the mountain road.
But Baghdadu was never found. No sandals, no badge, no pouch. Some later speculated he had fallen into a ravine. Others said he had been attacked by wolves, or perhaps robbed by local mountain clans who did not respect the king's road. Still others whispered that he had defected, sold the message to a rival satrap, and disappeared into the north. All were plausible, but none were proven. What's interesting is not just his disappearance, but what happened because of it. The message, which never arrived, evidently contained something that would have slowed or prevented the dispatch of troops to western Lydia. In the weeks following Baghdadu's vanishing, Darius, unaware of the lost report, authorized a deployment of reserve forces to Sardis. That in turn led to a minor incident in a region that was already tense with revolt. Several Greek cities heard of the movement and interpreted it as a threat, precipitating early actions that contributed to the Ionian revolt. This isn't to say Baghdadu's lost run caused a war. History is never that simple. But it's a reminder that the great dramas of empire often hang by dull, nearly invisible threads. One message, one runner, one path lost to fog, or a loose rock underfoot. It is easy to think of empires as steel-plated machines, armies, orders, lines drawn in stone. But the truth is more fragile. Every message had to be trusted to human legs, human lungs, and human memory. There was no redundancy, no backups. When a courier vanished, so did the knowledge he carried. After Baghdadu's disappearance, the Achaemenid road system changed slightly.
More couriers were assigned to sensitive messages. A protocol was developed for double-carrying high-risk communications. 2 runners traveling separate routes to ensure redundancy. And at the Shahyar post, a small shrine was built. Not officially named after Baghdadu, but the locals called it the Messenger's Stone. Travelers would leave small offerings there, grains, pebbles, or feathers tied with string. Did his brother ever find peace? The records fall silent, but the letter he wrote was preserved, and in that small, pleading voice across the centuries, we hear not empire, but something older. The aching grief of one person who simply wanted to know what happened to the one he loved. And if that's not history, what is? But this section leaves us with the question: what exactly was Baghdadu carrying? Why was it so urgent? And how much did the empire rely on runners like him? Quiet, loyal, and vanishing into the dark. In the final section of this story, we'll trace the life of a senior road official who tried to make sense of the courier network, counting its flaws, recording its failures, and ultimately designing a system so dependable it would influence Roman and Byzantine mail centuries later.
Now let us step into the sandals of another man entirely. He was not a courier. He did not run. He did not carry messages across mountains, nor sleep beside oil lamps in roadside huts. His name was Artapana, and his job was perhaps the dullest in the entire Achaemenid bureaucracy. Artapana was, for lack of a better title, a postal auditor. You can imagine him, a middle-aged official, wrapped in the soft wool of Susa's scribal class, seated beneath a canopy of reed matting. He was neither powerful nor poetic. His days were spent examining clay tablets, tallying delivery times, and checking the thickness of horse bridle ropes. Yet it is because of men like Artapana that we know how Persia's great postal system didn't just survive, but functioned with a kind of mechanical elegance. Artapana's work began after the disappearance of courier Baghdadu, though he would never have known the man's name. What he did know was that delays had increased. Messages were going missing. Some provincial governors were blaming sabotage. Others suspected incompetence. And so Darius I, ever the organizer, dispatched Artapana to investigate the reliability of the road itself. This meant months of travel. Not on horseback, mind you. He rode in an ox cart, the slowest and most stable of all methods, so that he could write while moving. With him were 2 junior scribes, a cook, and 4 guards. His task: inspect every Pyrodati station between Sardis and Persepolis. Observe the condition of horses. Check for water levels in cisterns. Interview postmasters. And most of all, verify the time it took for a message to travel between any 2 points. He did it with a set of numbered tokens. Each morning, a runner would be given a clay disc, marked with that day's date and an animal symbol. The receiving station would carve the arrival time into their own copy of the disc, and Artapana would later match them. This allowed him to measure not only time, but pace variation, station efficiency, and even runner fatigue. Some days he recorded messages arriving early, others were a disaster. In one case, a message took 17 hours to travel a 12-mile stretch because a jackal had bitten a horse's leg and no replacement could be found. Artapana noted dryly, horse unsound, runner barefoot, message carried in teeth, delay acceptable. It wasn't glamorous work, but Artapana was nothing if not thorough.
Over time, he compiled what may have been the first true road performance audit in recorded history. He calculated how often message pouches tore, every 78 uses. How many relay horses were lame, 1 in 9, and how long scribes at each station typically kept records before clay tablets were recycled or worn away by weather, on average 6 months. He also made recommendations. Among them, replace reed and hide message pouches with linen sleeves reinforced with wax. Introduce foot salve for runners in hot provinces. Require that every 5th courier carry a backup seal in case of loss. Standardize food rations to include dates and dried lentils, not just barley. Assign temporary scribes to each station during flood season so that backups were kept even if river crossings were delayed. Most of these changes were adopted. A few were not. Linen was too expensive, and dates tended to attract ants. But the most significant of Artapana's innovations came near the end of his career. He proposed a master route map, hand-copied onto leather sheets and distributed to all major satrapal offices. This map would mark not only stations, but distances, elevations, and known hazards, flood-prone areas, cliffs, regions with wolves. While such maps had existed in fragments, Artapana's version would be the first standardized empire-wide guide to the Royal Road. The idea was simple. If every official understood the terrain, they could better plan for delays. Messages would be routed through safer paths, time could be budgeted more precisely, and runners, many of whom had never seen a map, could be trained using scale drawings scratched into clay tablets during orientation. The master map never survived. We have only references to it from a later Greek traveler who wrote that Persian road stations were so marked and maintained, a blind man could find his way with a stick. That may be exaggeration, but only slightly. Artapana's final audit report ends with a quiet sentence. The system works. It works only because men do. There's no drama in that. No conquest, no betrayal, no divine lightning strike, just a road. A road that stretched for thousands of miles, dotted with oil lamps and tired horses, and made possible by the most mundane human virtues: patience, routine, and the willingness to run through darkness for someone else's words. After Artapana retired, he returned to Susa and reportedly taught scribal arithmetic to children. When he died, he was buried with a stylus and one of his route tokens, marked with the symbol of a lion. Today, the Royal Road is mostly dust and memory, but fragments of it remain. Stones sunk deep into the earth, worn by sandals, marked by calloused feet and thousands of unsent letters. And in those forgotten pathways, there lingers a quiet truth. Sometimes, the history that holds the most weight is the one that traveled in silence. It is one of those mornings that begins with wind, dry, thin, and just sharp enough to sting the face. Somewhere deep in the Zagros Mountains, near a pass the locals called the Goat's Elbow, a message runner was due to arrive before midday. He never did. His name was Bakdadu, that much we know, not from royal archives, but from a half-broken tablet discovered during a dig in 1936. The tablet was not official. It was a private letter, and its contents hint at one of the rare moments when the great faceless postal system of the Achaemenids cracked just slightly and revealed the human stories inside it. Bakdadu's job was, on the surface, unremarkable. He was a relay courier on a section of the Royal Road that twisted dangerously through high elevation and narrow canyons. His usual run was between two posting stations, Shahyar to Tuskira, about 18 miles of bad footing, hungry jackals, and switchback paths worn into the mountainside by thousands of feet before him. But what made this run unusual was the urgency of the message he carried. We don't have the original message, but from surrounding correspondence and the careful attention given to what followed, it seems Bakdadu was delivering a direct note from the satrap of Media to Darius I himself. The contents? Likely a report of troop movement in Lydia, possibly a suspected rebellion. Whatever it was, the fact that it needed a personal courier instead of a standard rotation implies extreme sensitivity. And then Bakdadu vanished. The tablet that tells his story was not written by a courtier or a general, but by his younger brother. It reads in translation, "I write again, for the 6th time. My brother Bakdadu went out from Shahyar station 3 days past the new moon. He had eaten, his legs were strong, he wore his badge and the sandals with thick strap. He did not come to Tuskira. He was not seen. The goatsmen at the cliff say they heard a cry. I ask you now, where is his badge? Where is the pouch, the message? Was there flood? Was there stonefall? Please answer me, or send me to search. I will not eat until he is found." Imagine this. The sun has not yet fully risen, but you're already awake. The air is heavy with the sour scent of last night's cooking oil, mingled with wet wool and the faint, musty aroma of limestone dust from the street. You lie still for a moment, listening, because that's how you tell what kind of day it's going to be. If you hear the bread seller early, it means the streets are dry. If the pipes gurgle below, it means the aqueduct has not yet been shut off. This is life in a Roman insula, an apartment building, And you, for the purposes of this story, are neither senator nor soldier, but a rope-maker's apprentice living with your family on the third floor of a wooden-framed block in Subura, Rome's most densely packed district. Forget the marble atriums and grand bathhouses. That's not your Rome. Your Rome is 30 feet up, built mostly from cheap brick and even cheaper wooden beams. It sways slightly when the wind picks up, and the walls are so thin that you can hear the man next door cough in his sleep. Welcome to the real urban life of the ancient world. The insula is one of Rome's more underappreciated innovations, vertical living, long before the elevator. The term itself means island, because the buildings seem to rise up like isolated outcrops from the sea of narrow streets. Your building houses roughly 60 people, maybe more if the potter's family below has taken in another cousin. There's no central plumbing, no fire escape, and certainly no privacy. But it is, by Roman standards, affordable, and most days, functional. Your day starts early, before sunrise if you're sensible. The staircases are steep and without railings, so you'll want to descend while there's still some light filtering in from the oculus-shaped window near the corner. First stop, the communal latrine at street level if the line isn't too long. Otherwise, you use the chamber pot and leave it on the landing for collection. Yes, that's a job, and yes, it pays poorly. Next, water. You'll join a queue at the corner fountain, aqueduct-fed most days. You carry a clay jug on your hip and try not to let your tunic drag through the mud, though frankly, everything smells like yesterday's stew and donkey anyway. As the city begins to stir, the building comes alive. Below your level is a family of mosaic tilers. They argue often and loudly. Their youngest, a boy of about 6, spends most of his time dropping dried beans into cracks in the floorboards. He seems to believe it's a form of banking. On the 4th floor is a weaver's widow who used to be a midwife. She no longer takes patients, but she will, occasionally, offer strong opinions on births she overhears through the walls. Her goat, and on the 2nd floor, closest to the street, lives the baker who starts his oven before dawn. This is both a blessing and a curse. The scent is delightful, but it attracts rodents. You sometimes hear them in the walls at night, chewing at old mortar. You are expected to be at the rope stall near the forum by the 2nd hour. That gives you just enough time to chew a corner off a barley loaf, brush the grit from your eyes, and slip through the maze of alleyways that separates Subura from the slightly more respectable merchant district. Today, the stairwell is already crowded. A man is trying to carry a bundle of kindling up to the 5th floor, muttering with every step. You give way, then stop briefly to help the basket girl retrieve her spilled figs. You've helped her 3 times this month. She smiles, but says nothing. That's enough. The roof is accessible if you know the trick of the latch near the laundry line. It's where people go to talk, dry clothes, and, on warm nights, sleep because it's too hot below. Technically, it's illegal to build rooftop shacks, but 3 already dot your building. Each is occupied by a family, too large or too poor to find space inside. You once considered asking your father if you could build one. He replied with a story of a friend who lived in a roof shack that collapsed during a storm. No bones were broken, but the man was coated in 6 months of pigeon droppings and had to grow a beard to avoid being recognized. By the time you leave for work, the building is fully awake. A boy is singing somewhere. A woman is scrubbing a copper pot with stale wine. You step around a puddle of what you hope is water and push open the heavy, soot-smudged door that leads onto the street.
Subura greets you with the usual: noise, smoke, the bark of dogs, the smell of onions. It is chaotic, crowded, and alive. And as you walk away from your insula, you realize something very Roman. You don't need to see the Colosseum to know you live in the empire. You can feel it in the vibrations of footsteps above you, in the thump of a goat on a balcony, in the hum of life, layered floor upon floor, ceiling beneath ceiling. And yet, as you make your way down the sloping road toward the workshop, you can't help but wonder, how did the Romans keep these buildings standing? Who made the rules? What happened when something collapsed? In Section 2, we'll climb higher into the construction, regulation, and quiet politics of the insula itself.
Let us return to the insula, but this time, not as a tenant. Instead, you are now a builder, or more precisely, a redemptor, a Roman construction contractor. You're not a senator or even a citizen, but you wear a decent tunic, keep styluses behind your ear, and know a thing or two about lime mortar, brick sizes, and which inspectors can be bribed with a warm loaf and a promise. It's the early 2nd century CE. Rome is booming. The city is swelling with laborers, merchants, freedmen, and immigrants. Space is tight. Land is expensive. And everyone, from wine cellars to aging gladiators with sore knees, needs somewhere to live. That's where you come in. The Roman insula was the empire's answer to high-density housing. They were, in essence, ancient apartment blocks, rising 4 to 7 stories high, though anything beyond 5 was legally frowned upon after multiple collapses. The word frowned upon, of course, being more theory than practice. At ground level, most insulae featured shops, bakeries, taverns, barbers, and rental stalls called taberni. These helped offset the cost of construction. Above that, the floors stacked up in rough brick and timber boxes, the wealthiest residents on the lower floors, the poorest and hottest up top. The materials? Well, that depended on the budget. The structure, foundations, were shallow. Roman builders preferred to dig only a couple of feet deep, then lay crushed stone, broken tile, and lime mortar to form a packed base. Load-bearing walls were built from concrete, faced with opus latericium, that is, layers of brick laid in tidy rows. The bricks were made from clay and fired in communal kilns, often stamped with the mark of the estate that produced them. Timber was used liberally, especially for floors, upper walls, and staircases. This, of course, made the buildings light, fast to erect, and deeply flammable. Ceiling heights varied. The lower floors, rented by merchants and wealthier tenants, enjoyed ceilings of 8 to 9 feet, sometimes with decorative plaster and painted borders. The upper floors were cramped, perhaps 5 to 6 feet high, just tall enough to stand if you weren't wearing a helmet or carrying anything on your head. Windows? Yes, but small and mostly unglazed. Upper floors had square holes shuttered with wooden flaps or oiled cloth. These admitted light, but also noise, smoke, and the occasional pigeon. Rome tried, on occasion, to regulate its vertical sprawl. Augustus introduced fire codes and height restrictions. Later, Emperor Nero declared that no insula should exceed 70 Roman feet, about 20 modern meters. These laws were meant to reduce collapse risk and improve safety, But enforcement was erratic, and the pressure to house the growing urban poor often overrode caution. Inspectors, when they came, measured walls with long wooden rods. But their tools were crude, and their motivations easily bent. Some demanded bribes, others looked the other way. One particularly creative contractor in Ostia was caught filling interior walls with sawdust instead of stone, an innovation that saved money but nearly killed his tenants when rats chewed through the support beams.
Property management. Most tenants didn't own their flats. They rented, monthly or annually, from landlords known as domini insularum. These landlords were rarely involved directly. They hired vilici, property stewards, to collect rent, mediate disputes, and perform basic maintenance. A good vilicus could keep an insula running smoothly for years. A bad one, well, many learned to listen for creaking beams in their sleep. Rents were typically lower the higher you climbed. Ground floor rooms might fetch 1,000 sesterces a year, if they had access to the street and fresh water. Fifth floor garrets, barely large enough to lie down in, could go for 100 or less. Tenants often shared rooms. Entire families squeezed into single chambers. Privacy was achieved not with walls, but curtains. Food was cooked communally or purchased from Thermopylae, hot food stalls that dotted every district. Most insulae lacked latrines above the first floor, which meant chamber pots emptied out of windows. Yes, really. A law existed against tossing waste from above, but like most laws about height and hygiene, it was more honored in breach than observance. Passing beneath an apartment window in Siberia meant taking your life and your tunic's cleanliness into your hands. Maintenance and collapse. Cracks in a walls were common. So were leaning staircases, water-damaged beams, and sagging ceilings. The lifespan of an insula was, by modern standards, short, perhaps 20 to 30 years without major repairs. When buildings collapsed, and they did, it was rarely front-page news. Poor tenants simply found another room in another creaking stack of bricks. There were no safety inspections after construction, no insurance, no refunds, and yet they persisted. Rome built hundreds of these vertical hives. By the early 3rd century, over 40,000 insulae dotted the city, housing perhaps 1 million people. They were noisy, unsafe, and often unsanitary, but they were also alive, teeming with stories, smells, and the quiet improvisations of the working class. This wasn't just housing, it was infrastructure for survival, a system held together by rope, shared ovens, gossip, and the daily miracle of getting water up 4 flights of stairs. And even today, archaeologists still debate, what would it have been like to fall asleep in a Roman insula? What did people dream about under beams that creaked and stars that flickered through slatted shutters? In Section 3, we'll look beyond the let's imagine now that the building is coming to its end. Not with flames or collapse, but in the quieter, more bureaucratic way things often end in Rome. The land your insula occupies has just been purchased by a consortium of wealthy investors, perhaps eyeing the site for a horium, a public granary, or even a small bathhouse, something modest but profitable. A notice is nailed to the wooden door frame downstairs. The building is condemned. Tenants have 3 days to vacate. You read the announcement and feel, more than anything, tired. Not shocked. This was always a possibility. But now, all at once, the wooden staircases you've climbed every morning, the little chisel marks where your brother once practiced writing his name, the smell of sour bread and charcoal in the evenings, all of it is going to vanish. So how does a Roman family move out of an insula? There are no moving carts, no paid services. You gather what you can, stools, blankets, your father's old rope splicing tools, and carry them down, bit by bit, through the swaying staircase, careful not to bump the plaster that's already flaking from the ceiling. The goat from the 4th floor balcony goes first, led by the weaver's widow, with a quiet dignity, as if this is simply a walk and not an exile. Children chase each other down the stairwell one last time, and someone leaves a jar of olives behind, forgotten in the rush. The building doesn't fall. It simply empties, one room at a time. The eviction process in Rome was as unceremonious as life in the insula itself. There were no formal protections for tenants. Leases, if written at all, were often flexible, month to month or seasonal, and landlords could remove tenants with little notice, especially if property values shifted. Sometimes demolitions were ordered from above. Emperor Hadrian, ever the architectural enthusiast, once razed entire blocks to make space for his projects. Other times, fire damage made a building uninhabitable, and frequently it was just time. Wood rotted, walls buckled, and gravity completed the sentence that flawed construction had begun. Displaced tenants looked for space elsewhere. The echoes of occupancy. The ground floor merchants would often resettle first. Their tabernae might be rebuilt elsewhere, sometimes within days. The baker, if he had money saved, could rent space in another block or pool resources with a neighbor to open a shared oven. For some, this was an opportunity. Subura was constantly shifting, and prime corner locations didn't stay vacant long. For others, the move meant downsizing, fewer rooms, higher rent, or relocation to the city's fringes. The upper floors, occupied by the poorest, rarely had options. Some families merged households. Others slipped into the growing homeless population. There were no census follow-ups, no preservation of memory. And yet, archaeologists today, when they scrape away centuries of ash and soil, find the echoes. Coins wedged in floorboards, tiny terracotta oil lamps in corners that once held beds, graffiti scratched into brick walls, names, prices, even crude jokes about landlords. One inscription, found in the ruins of an Ostian insula, reads, "Secundus was here. He was cold and slept with his boots on." Another, in cramped Latin script, "Lucilla wept when the dog fell from the balcony." The lived experience of the insula was ephemeral, but it left these delicate fingerprints, touches of human life, captured in mortar, soot, and charcoal. They remind us that even the most modest, forgettable dwellings held entire lifetimes. Insulae in the empire. It wasn't just Rome. As the empire spread, so did its housing model. Insulae sprang up in Ostia, Carthage, Alexandria, and even parts of Gaul. They became a symbol of Roman urban life, dense, efficient, and endlessly replaceable. But none matched the scale of Rome itself. At its peak, the city may have housed over 1 million people, and of those, a staggering 90% lived in insulae, not palaces, not villas, but crumbling towers of brick and wood leaning toward each other like neighbors in conversation. And yet, they worked. These buildings housed philosophers and prostitutes, laborers and lectors, fishmongers and fire watchers. They enabled social mixing on a scale few other ancient cities allowed. A poor rope maker might live above a retired centurion. A foreign spice trader might share a war with a washerwoman and her 3 daughters. Their lives rubbed elbows, literally, through shared walls and staircases. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't always safe, but it was Rome. And as we close this story, you might still be wondering, what did it feel like, truly, to live in a building that swayed when a neighbor coughed, to climb 4 floors in sandals every day just for water, to share not just space but smell, sound, and seasons with dozens of strangers? Perhaps it felt like being part of a city that pulsed not from its marble temples, but from its rooftops and doorsteps, its narrow staircases and smoky kitchens, a city not just built of stone, but of stories. The year is 1143, and you are standing ankle-deep in damp earth, holding a long-handled hoe and trying not to think about the blisters. The air smells of peat smoke and damp wool. A church bell tolls faintly in the distance. You're a turnip farmer, and while this may not seem like the most thrilling role in the grand pageant of history, rest assured, it is crucial and considerably more strategic than you might expect. Welcome to the County of Flanders, a region now straddling parts of modern-day Belgium and northern France. It's one of the more densely populated and agriculturally ambitious corners of medieval Europe. And while lords and bishops may command the stories in the illuminated manuscripts, it is people like you, peasants with hoes and stubborn root vegetables, who keep the whole system going. Let's begin with the setting. Your village is small, maybe 100 souls, centered around a wooden church and surrounded by open fields, hedgerows, and swampy commons. Your home is a single-room wattle and daub hut, its thatched roof held down by stones, its walls patched with more hope than structural knowledge. Your field lies just outside the village boundary, part of a larger system known as the open field arrangement. There are no tidy fences here. Instead, land is divided into long, thin strips, each shared and worked communally. You have a few of these strips, celions they're called, and your main crop, at least this year, is turnips. Yes, turnips. You might be wondering why not wheat, barley, or oats, more glamorous staples of the medieval diet, but the answer lies in both biology and politics. Turnips are hardy. They grow in poor soil. They survive frost. They can be stored in root cellars through the winter, fed to livestock, or boiled into a vaguely edible mash. Most importantly, they are an ideal component of crop rotation, a concept surprisingly well understood by even the humblest medieval peasant. The fields around you are divided into a 3-year rotation. 1 year for grain, wheat, or rye, 1 for legumes or vegetables like turnips or beans, and 1 fallow, allowing the soil to recover. This system prevents nutrient depletion and keeps yields relatively steady, an agricultural trick known as the 3-field system. You didn't invent this system, but you follow it with the seriousness of a monk copying scripture. Because if your rotation fails, you don't get paid. And yes, you do get paid, though not in coin, and certainly not in the amounts you deserve. The economy of root vegetables. Most of what you grow goes to your lord. You are not a slave, but a villain, a type of serf bound to the land. You owe your lord a portion of your harvest, some free labor each month, and a small share of your livestock. You also owe him gratitude.
Still, you're not without opportunity. If your turnip crop is particularly good this year, and the rains have been kind, you might have extra to trade at the market in Ypres or perhaps even Bruges, if your mule holds out. At the market, your turnips fetch modest prices. A sack of plump, clean turnips might be worth 1/10 of a silver penny. With careful saving and the right bribes to toll keepers, you might even buy cabbage seed for next year or salt to preserve pork. Or if you're feeling ambitious, a second-hand pot from the tinker with only a few holes. But there's risk, too. Prices vary. 1 year, cabbage floods the market and undercuts your turnips. Another, your mule throws a shoe and you can't transport anything. And there's always the looming fear of spoilage. Too much rain, and your root cellar turns into a swamp. Even so, you're not just surviving, you're navigating a complex web of barter, debt, and seasonal planning. Medieval farming isn't just toil, it's timing. You plant turnips not just to eat, but to hedge against bad oat harvests. You rotate crops not just to rest the soil, but to impress the steward who collects rents. In your small way, you're playing a game of strategy against nature, neighbors, and the local clergy who always seem to show up with tithes due the week after your best produce has rotted. You rise before dawn. In summer, you labor 12 hours or more. In winter, you mend tools, dig drainage trenches, or help thatch the roof of your cousin's hut. He's terrible at it, and his goats keep eating the insulation. Meals are plain but sustaining. A typical day might include pottage, a thick stew of grains and vegetables, dark rye bread, and a bit of goat's milk or ale. Meat is rare unless a pig dies of natural causes, which it often does. Festivals and saints' days are a highlight, offering not just rest, but communal storytelling, music, and gossip. You listen to the reeve argue with the blacksmith about the price of dried onions. You hear tales of distant cities, battles, and miraculous turnips that grew to the size of a dog. You nod, smile, and stir your soup. You know your place in the world. But within that place, you improvise, adapt, and scheme just enough to get by. Still, as you sit in the dirt and inspect your turnips, some round and proud, others misshapen like forgotten boots, you wonder, what happens if the harvest fails? What do you do when the church wants tithes, the Lord demands levies, and the sky gives only hail? In Section 2, we'll delve into exactly that, the threats the turnip farmers faced, and how they responded with quiet ingenuity, grim endurance, and the occasional cabbage-related rebellion.
Let's return to the field. The turnips are not doing well. It's early spring, and the rain hasn't let up in weeks. The soil, already heavy with clay, has turned to soup, and the shallow roots of your precious crop are starting to rot. You dig out a few specimens and shake your head. Soft, cracked, hollow in places. Not good. Not good at all. This is what you feared in Section 1, a bad harvest. But you're not helpless. You, dear farmer, are part of a long tradition of risk management that predates spreadsheets and insurance adjusters. You have your tools, your calendar, and your well-earned suspicion of any cloud that looks too enthusiastic. The medieval toolkit for surviving a bad year. First and foremost, there's diversification. You don't only grow turnips. You've tucked onions between the rows. You planted a few beans last fall. You've got chickens pecking around the yard, and your wife's cousin raises geese. He's a bit odd, but the geese lay well. You've also stored. A portion of last year's turnips sits in a damp but serviceable root cellar beneath your hut. The best ones, the firm ones, were dipped in clay and wrapped in straw. They'll last through late spring, maybe early summer if rationed carefully. Next, there's bartering. Your neighbor grows cabbage, and while he's no great conversationalist, his wife brews potent nettle ale. You'll offer him a sack of barley you were saving for the reeve in exchange for enough cabbages to stretch your family through Lent. Then there's your ultimate fallback, the commons. The role of the commons in survival. Communal land surrounds your village. Meadows, woods, and streams that belong to everyone and no one. It's here you can graze your goat, gather firewood, trap rabbits, if you're quiet, and forage for berries or wild garlic. The commons are your safety net. They are often overused, yes, and watched jealously by stewards and lords.
But when the turnips fail, the commons keep your family fed. Of course, this doesn't solve all problems. You still owe the Lord his due, tithes and rents, the unyielding demands. Here's where the tension sets in. Medieval agriculture was flexible. Medieval obligations were not. Even in a bad year, you owe your tithe to the church. 10% of your produce, your wool, your eggs. If you can't pay in kind, you'll pay in labor, maybe repairing the monastery. Then you face fines, or worse, confiscation of tools. Sometimes even a temporary seizure of your ox. No ox, no plow. No plow, no harvest. And thus the cycle continues. But farmers are not passive. Oh no. How peasants pushed back. History loves kings and revolutions, but beneath it all is a steady drumbeat of small resistance. And sometimes even the turnip farmer gets fed up. You've heard the whispers. In the nearby village of Lisvega, peasants banded together last year and refused to pay their tithe in full. They claimed a mildew blight. They pointed to the worm-eaten wheat and the shriveled parsnips. The priest eventually relented, after his garden wall mysteriously collapsed in a windstorm. In East Anglia, entire villages have banded together in collective bargaining. They submit complaints to the manor court. They withhold labor until drainage ditches are repaired. Some lords, fearing mass abandonment, actually listen. And every so often, rare but real, there's a cabbage rebellion. No, not an organized uprising of vegetables. A cabbage rebellion is the term whispered by local reeves when an overtaxed village collectively decides to withhold its best produce and deliver only the ugliest, wormiest cabbages, turnips, or leeks to the manor. Ah, yes, they say, with innocent faces, a poor year. Meanwhile, the best crops are quietly sold at distant markets for coin, hidden in straw carts bound for the abbey's neighbor town. It's risky. If caught, fines follow. But it's also a form of quiet agency. You cannot storm the castle gates, but you can certainly make sure the baron's stew is a little more fibrous than usual. Knowledge as survival. You are not formally educated, but your knowledge is deep. You know how to read the sky, how to hear the soil after a hard frost, how to time your planting by the length of shadow at midday. You know which neighbors are reliable, which clerics are lenient, and which reeves have wine cellars worth breaking into, should things ever come to that. And perhaps, most critically, you know how to listen. You trade news with the traveling peddler. You keep an ear open at market for rumors of regional weather patterns. A cold spring in Normandy? Still, one truth lingers at the edge of every planting season. You can only control so much. You can manage your fields, barter with neighbors, and charm the reeve, but you cannot outplan the sky. So as you mend your fence and dig a new drainage channel, you wonder, what does the future hold for people like you? If the weather worsens,
If the markets shift, if war arrives, how do you adapt? In Section 3, we'll explore the changing face of peasant life in the late medieval period, the early hints of independence, and how even the humble turnip farmer might, just might, begin to see beyond the furrow.
You wake one morning, not to the familiar crow of your rooster, but to silence. The village feels paused.
The air is still, save for the faint rustle of wind through thatch and the soft clink of your wife ladling yesterday's barley gruel into a clay bowl. The sky is overcast, not ominous, just heavy, as if holding something back. Your turnip crop is fair this year. Not a miracle, but firm, dry, even slightly sweet. You should feel relief. But instead, something else stirs in you. A quiet itch you can't place. A sense that things are shifting. And they are. Welcome to the late 13th century, an era of subtle but profound transformation for the medieval peasant. You may not know the term proto-capitalism, and you've never seen a ledger in your life, but you can feel the currents changing beneath your feet, like water moving under the frozen canal. The first whisper of wages. Once your life was entirely bound to the Lord's land. You owed labor, produce, and loyalty in exchange for the right to till a few muddy strips of soil. You didn't question it. It was how the world worked, how it had always worked. But now, something peculiar is happening in the nearby towns. Word spreads that merchants in Bruges and Ghent are hiring laborers for wages, actual money, not grain, not goats, but small, round coins stamped with the Count's seal. Even in your own village, the steward has begun paying a few trusted men to help build a granary wall. Pay is meager, of course, but it is pay. It begins to dawn on you, perhaps not all at once, but slowly, like the way mist creeps along the hedgerows, that not all labor must be owed. Some can be chosen. The implications are dizzying. You could, if the harvest is good, sell your turnips at market and keep the money. You could hire someone else to help in the fields, rather than rely on your sons who are growing restless. You could, with time and luck, buy your own freedom. This is not fantasy. In some regions, peasants are doing just that, purchasing their manumission, the legal release from servile status. It is expensive. It requires cunning, but it is real. The rise of the towns. Towns are growing too, and they offer something strange and dangerous: anonymity. In the city, no one knows if you were born a villain. No one asks if your father tithed late, or if your uncle once poached a stag from the bishop's forest. Your neighbor's daughter has already left for Ypres. She sends letters dictated to the parish clerk about a shopkeeper she works for who makes candles from rendered sheep fat. It doesn't sound glamorous, but she earns 2 pennies a week and owns a pair of shoes without holes. It's enough to make you wonder, how long will the land hold your children? Freedom, but also fragility. Of course, not all is rising. You've heard of strange coughs spreading in Italian ports. Bad harvests still come in pairs. And when prices climb faster than wages, well, the town doesn't look so welcoming after all. You also hear rumors of enclosure,
Some lords are fencing in common land, especially in England. What was once everyone's pasture becomes someone's private sheepfold. Wool sells better than wheat, and sheep don't argue or ask for days off. Your commons for now are intact, but you keep an eye on the hedgerows. You notice when the steward measures parcels with new string. You listen harder when the old men whisper by the smithy about changes coming from Paris. And still, you plant. Legacy in the soil. As you walk your field in early autumn, the turnip leaves splayed like little green hands across the furrows. You think about your place in all this. You are not a knight. You are not a merchant. You're a farmer, one among thousands who has coaxed food from unpromising soil year after year. But you matter. The grain you grew fed the soldiers who guarded the town walls. The wool your sheep wore warmed the monks who copied Aristotle. The taxes you grumbled through paved the road on which future revolutions would roll their carts. More than anything, you represent continuity. You stand at the hinge of two worlds, one of obligation and tradition, the other of possibility and change. Will your children be farmers? Perhaps. Or perhaps they'll be scribes, clerks, shopkeepers, or even monks. One of them might carry a turnip into a walled town and trade it for ink, or glass, or a song. And so as you kneel down and pull a turnip from the earth, you wonder, was this a life of survival or strategy, of dull repetition or quiet innovation? Perhaps it was both. Perhaps that is what history always was. In must, patiently tended by hands.
Imagine it. A road so long it would take you more than a month to walk. If you didn't stop for sleep, food, or sandals with better arch support. A road built not to carry armies, nor pilgrims, nor caravans weighed down with spice. But letters. Yes, letters. Welcome to the Persian Royal Road. Constructed under the reign of Darius I around the 5th century BCE, it stretched from Sardis, near the Aegean Sea, all the way to Susa, the beating administrative heart of the Achaemenid Empire. It spanned some 1,600 miles, or more depending on the camel you ask, and it helped bind together one of the most logistically impressive empires the ancient world had ever seen. If you're picturing a majestic stone-paved highway lined with cypress trees and busts of kings, hold that thought. Most of it was dirt. But it was organized dirt, and that made all the difference. Darius I, the bureaucrat king. You may know Darius as the guy who battled the Greeks and lost at Marathon, but his true genius was not in war, it was in administration. He understood something fundamental. No empire can thrive if its satraps, regional governors, are left to guess what the capital wants, or when it wants it. So Darius did what every efficiency-loving ruler dreams of. He built a communications network. And not just any network, a fast, reliable government-funded system of message couriers known as the Ungarium. The Ungarium was made up of royal messengers on horseback, swift riders who rode day and night in relay, switching horses at designated posts, called Ungaria, spaced roughly a day's ride apart. If that sounds like an ancient FedEx system, you wouldn't be far off. These couriers could cover the entire royal road, yes, the full 1,600 miles, in about 7 days.
7. By comparison, an average traveler on foot would take 90 days to make the same trip. Even a determined ox cart would plod along for weeks, but a royal courier, thanks to frequent horse changes and imperial priority, flew across the empire like a whisper on the wind. Neither snow nor rain nor scorching desert. The Persian couriers were famously reliable. The Greek historian Herodotus, who had a flair for both exaggeration and quotable lines, praised them like this: "Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds." Sound familiar? That's the motto engraved on the staging stations. The real secret sauce. How did they do it? The secret lay in the infrastructure. Darius ordered the construction of chapar khaneh, relay stations equipped with fresh horses, food, and a designated official whose job was to maintain readiness. Think of it as a kind of rest stop crossed with a fire station. Riders didn't rest. They handed off the message and leapt onto a fresh horse. No delay, no dawdling. Each station was manned by trained personnel who could ensure the letter continued down the line, uninterrupted. Horses were fed and watered. Riders were expected to know every twist of the road. The system functioned with a precision we rarely associate with the ancient world. Of course, not everything went smoothly. There were occasional holdups, bandits, flash floods, or the occasional satrap who misplaced an important message. But woe to the station chief who allowed delays. The Persian Empire had little tolerance for inefficiency, especially when it came to the king's words. What kind of messages were sent? You might expect epic proclamations or dramatic war decrees, and you'd be right sometimes, but more often the messages were dull but essential. Tax collection deadlines, grain quotas, reprimands for satraps who underperformed, updates on weather patterns affecting trade, orders to standardize coinage, edicts about calendar adjustments. It's bureaucratic, certainly, but it was also the glue that held the empire together. In an age where news typically traveled only as fast as someone could walk, the Persians moved information faster than any other pre-modern civilization. And information, as every administrator knows, is power. So, what was it like to be a courier? You'd be young, light, likely from a family with some standing. Reliability mattered. You were trained to ride hard and fast, to read simple ciphers, and to recite royal formulas with clarity. You wore a distinctive sash and carried a small seal of office. People made way when you galloped into town. You were not a messenger, you were the king's voice. Still, your life wasn't glamorous. You barely slept. You rode through cold, rain, heat, dust storms. You passed over mountains, through deserts, and along rivers swollen with spring runoff. You ate quickly, rode silently, and passed your message to the next rider like a torch in the dark. No glory, just speed. But for all its efficiency, the Angarium raised an interesting problem. The faster messages moved, the more the center could control the periphery. So what happened when the provinces pushed back? In Section 2, we'll explore how this well-oiled machine sometimes strained under the weight of its own perfection, how rebellions, bottlenecks, and clever satraps challenged the system Darius built.
So here you are, one of the 20-some satraps of the mighty Achaemenid Empire. Your territory stretches across fertile plains and dry hills. Your palace is stocked with tribute from a dozen subject peoples, and your servants whisper your name with reverence. But every time you hear hoofbeats coming up the royal road, your stomach tightens just a little. You know what's coming. A letter sealed with the golden emblem of Darius, or later Xerxes, or Artaxerxes, or whichever long-bearded ruler currently sits in Susa. You'll be expected to read it immediately, carry out its orders precisely, and respond with updates using the same courier system. And while the road has granted you power, reach, and access, it has also tethered you to a central authority that notices everything. The danger of knowing too quickly. Speedy communication was a two-edged sword. Yes, it helped squash revolts, collect taxes, and unify policy across a multicultural empire. But it also meant there was very little wiggle room for local autonomy. Satraps couldn't claim ignorance. They couldn't delay action by pretending they hadn't received the king's orders, and they couldn't quietly line their pockets with silver without someone eventually finding out, because information now traveled with astonishing efficiency. Some governors found clever ways around this. A few, like the satrap Megabyzus of Syria, rebelled outright. Others became masters of the slow response, feigning illness, reporting vague weather troubles that kept roads impassable, or sending couriers with deliberately garbled versions of royal decrees. You couldn't stop the system, but you could jam it, just a little. Rebellion by relay. The Persian postal system was designed to suppress insurrection, but at least twice in its long history, it became the very mechanism by which rebellion was coordinated. Take the revolt of Cyrus the Younger in the 4th century BCE, when he tried to seize the throne from his brother King Artaxerxes II. Cyrus was a satrap himself, overseeing Lydia and Phrygia, key western regions with access to roads, wealth, and troops. Rather than moving openly at first, Cyrus used the imperial communication routes to quietly coordinate troop movements under the guise of defending the empire's western front. His letters to fellow satraps were vague but friendly. He leveraged the very system meant to prevent treason to organize one of the most audacious coups in Persian history. It failed, of course, famously so, during the Battle of Cunaxa, but it revealed a central irony of the royal road. Control and subversion were never more than a saddle apart. The role of road keepers. To counter this,
They checked seals. They monitored traffic. They ensured only approved messengers used the relay stations. But even these safeguards had limits. When Egypt broke away under Amartaeus in 404 BCE, the only successful native Egyptian revolt during Persian rule, the news was deliberately delayed. Local officials likely intercepted couriers or burned messages before they could reach Susa. By the time the king knew what was happening, the delta was already out of reach. Not even the finest postal system in the ancient world could control every whisper of rebellion. Even in peacetime, there were challenges. Some segments of the road became impassable in spring floods. Others were buried under sandstorms that swallowed entire stations. The stations required constant upkeep: hay for horses, guards for messengers, roofs for couriers caught in Anatolian sleet. Sometimes a station would go dark for months, cut off by tribal conflicts or a local famine. The mail would pile up in nearby hubs. Important messages would be delayed and satraps left guessing. In times of imperial weakness, during succession crises, say, the entire system faltered. Messages grew contradictory. Multiple claimants to the throne sent competing decrees. Couriers didn't know which seal to trust. The road was efficient, but it relied entirely on the illusion of central stability. And then came the Greeks. When Alexander the Great began his march into Persia in 334 BCE, he didn't destroy the royal road.
he used it. His armies marched along it. His officers intercepted Persian messengers. His intelligence officers, yes, he had those, used the road to monitor troop positions, forge documents, and sow confusion. It was a brilliant move, conquering not only the cities, but the empire's very means of self-organization. By the time Alexander took Susa in 331 BCE, the road system was already slipping from imperial hands. Still, he admired it. In fact, Alexander maintained the network after his conquest. So did the Seleucid kings who followed. And the Romans later copied it, putting relay stations every 20 miles along their famous roads and calling the system the cursus publicus. Good ideas, it seems, ride a long way. So here's the puzzle. Can a system designed for control also be an engine for rebellion? In Section 3, we'll ride the last stretch of the Royal Road, exploring what it meant for ordinary citizens, how messages were remembered in oral cultures, and why, in the end, this dusty dirt highway.
So far, we've followed the gallop of royal couriers across dusty plains and snowy mountain passes. We've sat in the saddle with the messengers of empire, watched satraps glance nervously at sealed scrolls, and seen how swift communication both empowered and undermined Persian control. But what about the people who didn't ride, who didn't receive scrolls or decode imperial messages? What about the thousands, millions, who lived just off the edge of the royal road? In this final section, we slow down. The horses have passed, the dust has settled, and in that quiet, we look at how the road shaped everyday life without ever directly inviting most people onto it. Because the truth is, if you were a farmer in ancient Persia, you probably never received a message from the king. You might never have seen one, but you still lived in the shadow of his road. To the common villager, the royal road was less a path than a rumor, something distant but real. You might see couriers flash by, horses foaming at the mouth. They didn't stop to speak, they weren't for you, but you'd hear them. You'd hear the sound of hooves, rapid, urgent, not like the gentle clip-clop of a merchant's mule. And when a child asked, "Who was that?" the answer might be whispered, reverent. That was the king's voice passing by. This created something powerful, an ambient presence of authority. People learned instinctively that orders came from far away, that laws and taxes and grain tallies weren't arbitrary. They came from Susa, through invisible strings stretched across the empire, pulled tight by couriers. In a world of oral storytelling, the royal road didn't just move messages, it moved myths of control, and myths are sticky. Still, not everything was about messages. The road had a practical life too. Farmers sometimes followed its margins to take wheat to market. Pilgrims walked it to reach shrines. Traders, though forbidden from using the official courier system, set up waypoints nearby, knowing the road's stations guaranteed some level of safety. Inns sprang up, so did stalls, small temples, even roadside entertainers. Imagine you're a basket weaver in a small Anatolian village. Maybe once a month you take your wares up to a roadside post to sell to travelers. You've never left your region, but you've met men from Babylon, soldiers from Bactria, maybe even a merchant from India. They all pass down the same road. The royal road didn't just unify the empire administratively, it stitched together its cultures, one dusty step at a time. Let's say a village waits for a tax relief order after a drought. The message was promised. The satrap said it had been sent, but it never arrived. When roads go silent, people grow suspicious. Rumors spread faster than couriers. In time,
Whole communities could rebel, not because of injustice alone, but because of mistrust in the system, a system that had promised efficiency and fairness, but sometimes failed when it mattered most. A lesson in longevity. Despite its flaws, the Persian road system outlived its builders. After the fall of the Achaemenids, the Seleucid kings used it. So did the Parthians and Sassanids. Centuries later, the Islamic Caliphate would repurpose parts of it, and caravans heading to China along the Silk Roads often followed its ghost. The bones of the Royal Road are still traceable today across Iran, Iraq, and Turkey. Archaeologists have uncovered old stations, some reduced to crumbled walls, others surprisingly intact, with cisterns and courtyards still recognizable. You could say it was boring, a road made mostly of dirt, maintained by mid-level bureaucrats, used to send dull messages about taxes, flood reports, or grain inventories. But that's exactly what made it work. It wasn't exciting. It was reliable. A virtue all too rare in empires. The quiet legacy. Perhaps the most remarkable thing is this: for all the glory of Persian kings, their conquests, monuments, and wars, the thing that most shaped daily life for millions was not a temple or a throne, but a road. A road you couldn't use, a road you couldn't command, but a road that determined how quickly you were taxed, warned about locusts, or summoned to provide grain or service. It was the heartbeat of the empire. You never saw it, but you felt it. Even now, when historians reconstruct the Achaemenid administrative system, they start with the road. Not the army, not the religion, the road. And when a sleepy village was told that a new rule had been passed by the great king in Susa, how did they know it was true? Because a courier had galloped past last night. And so, we come to the end of our ride down the Royal Road. From Darius's administrative vision to the quiet lives changed by messages they never read. In the end, the road was not only about information, it was about trust, time, and the delicate balance of power over distance. Imagine opening a crumbling, leather-bound book from the 14th century. The pages smell of cloves, vinegar, and smoke. The ink is faded, but the handwriting is neat, almost reverent. And what does the first line say? To make a good pottage for days of fish. You're not reading philosophy, not a royal edict, not even a prayer. You're holding a cookbook. But this isn't your average list of recipes. This is a record of what people actually ate. Day after day, feast after feast, Lent after Lent. And tucked between the lines, this little culinary book accidentally preserved something far more important than food. The quiet rhythms of medieval life,
complete with its shortages, improvisations, and leftovers. This is the story of one such book, or, more accurately, the many books like it. A scattered collection of parchment pages that have survived plague, war, and mice, offering us a slow-cooked, mildly greasy portal into the kitchens of long-dead scribes, monks, and middle-class stewards. You won't find exact measurements. You won't find preheated ovens. But you will find jellied eels, almond milk gravies, and a slightly alarming number of instructions involving stale bread. Welcome to the most comforting kind of history. What was for dinner? Who wrote these things? And why? One of the best preserved examples of these culinary records comes from England, compiled somewhere between 1390 and 1420. The book is now referred to as the Form of Curry, which, in delightfully confusing medieval English, means the method of cookery. It was likely written by the master cooks of King Richard II. But don't let the Royal Association fool you. This wasn't just high cuisine for court banquets. While the book begins with elaborate dishes, like peacock baked in its own feathers, it quickly pivots to soups for fasting days, stews to stretch leftover meat, and preserved vegetables that hint at scarcity and seasonality. In truth, it's a mix of practical instructions and culinary aspiration, like a medieval Pinterest board with just a bit too much saffron. These cookbooks weren't intended for beginners. The instruction, even the cook's vocabulary, suggests a relationship with leftovers. Words like regrated, reworked, stew, broth or stew, and salad, a dish made of scraps, show up constantly. And while some dishes might sound odd today, like hedgehog pudding, which mercifully used ground meat, not actual hedgehog, the guiding principle was simple: use everything, waste nothing, especially the expensive stuff. Spices like cinnamon, cloves, mace, and galangal weren't added just for flavor. They were medicine, status symbols, and incredibly costly. A pinch too much in a meat pie could equal a day's wages. So cooks reused sauces, strained leftover gravies into porridge, combined meat drippings with wine, boiled them down, and served them with lentils to make something that would keep until the next market day. In these recipes, you see the rhythm of a household where nothing ever stopped cooking. A surprisingly global pantry. And then, of course, there's the spice list. You might assume a 14th century English cookbook would feature turnips, onions, maybe some pork fat and barley. But you'd be wrong. The ingredients reveal a quietly global world. Long before Columbus, British cooks were using cinnamon from Sri Lanka, black pepper from India, nutmeg and cloves from the Moluccas, modern-day Indonesia, saffron from the Middle East or Spain, sugar, still a luxury, from Cyprus, Sicily, or North Africa. How did this happen?
Trade routes. By the 1300s, spice caravans snaked across the Silk Roads and through the Islamic world into Venice and Genoa. From there, goods passed into northern Europe via merchant ships, despite high costs and frequent spoilage. These were not ingredients for peasants, but even the middle class might scrape together enough for a pinch of pepper or saffron for special dishes. The cookbooks reflect this. Many recipes list optional ingredients like powder fort, a spice mix, or galangale, aromatic root, that the cook could include if they had it. Which brings us to one of the cookbook's most enduring features: flexibility. The medieval recipe as a suggestion. You'll never see 2 tablespoons or preheat oven to 375 degrees in a medieval recipe. Quantities are vague. Timing is looser than a modern.
So here you are, one of the 20-some satraps of the mighty Achaemenid Empire. Your territory stretches across fertile plains and dry hills. Your palace is stocked with tribute from a dozen subject peoples, and your servants whisper your name with reverence. But every time you hear hoofbeats coming up the royal road, your stomach tightens just a little. You know what's coming. A letter sealed with the golden emblem of Darius, or later Xerxes, or Artaxerxes, or whichever long-bearded ruler currently sits in Susa. You'll be expected to read it immediately, carry out its orders precisely, and respond with updates using the same courier system. And while the road has granted you power, reach, and access, it has also tethered you to a central authority that notices everything. The danger of knowing too quickly. Speedy communication was a two-edged sword. Yes, it helped squash revolts, collect taxes, and unify policy across a multicultural empire. But it also meant there was very little wiggle room for local autonomy. Satraps couldn't claim ignorance. They couldn't delay action by pretending they hadn't received the king's orders, and they couldn't quietly line their pockets with silver without someone eventually finding out, because information now traveled with astonishing efficiency. Some governors found clever ways around this. A few, like the satrap Megabyzus of Syria, rebelled outright. Others became masters of the slow response, feigning illness, reporting vague weather troubles that kept roads impassable, or sending couriers with deliberately garbled versions of royal decrees. You couldn't stop the system, but you could jam it, just a little. Rebellion by relay. The Persian postal system was designed to suppress insurrection, but at least twice in its long history, it became the very mechanism by which rebellion was coordinated. Take the revolt of Cyrus the Younger in the 4th century BCE, when he tried to seize the throne from his brother King Artaxerxes II. Cyrus was a satrap himself, overseeing Lydia and Phrygia, key western regions with access to roads, wealth, and troops. Rather than moving openly at first, Cyrus used the imperial communication routes to quietly coordinate troop movements under the guise of defending the empire's western front. His letters to fellow satraps were vague but friendly. He leveraged the very system meant to prevent treason to organize one of the most audacious coups in Persian history. It failed, of course, famously so, during the Battle of Cunaxa, but it revealed a central irony of the royal road. Control and subversion were never more than a saddle apart. The role of road keepers. To counter this, the empire.
So we end this first course with a pot gently simmering, a cook leaning against a soot-smudged hearth, and a scrap of parchment tucked in their apron, with a few messy notes about fish day pottage. In the next section, we'll step deeper into this culinary archive, examining how medieval kitchens were organized, how food shortages shaped meal planning, and why inventory ledgers might be the true secret to the survival of these cookbooks. Picture a long wooden bench. A fire crackles in the stone hearth nearby. The air smells of leeks, marrow bones, and something faintly sour, maybe vinegar. Beside a stack of onions and a sack of dried peas sits a carefully folded sheet of parchment. Not a prayer, not a poem, it's a ledger. Written in firm but practical script, it reads, 1 dozen eggs, Thursday, damp. 2 eels, salted, short. Barley, 1 sack. Almond milk prepared. Lard nearly gone. No pepper. This is the unsung hero of medieval cooking, the kitchen ledger. Because for every surviving medieval cookbook that preserves a stew recipe, there were 100 lists like this one. Half shopping notes, half inventory records. Often smudged with flour and grease, written by underpaid clerks or literate stewards, these everyday scraps of ink and parchment quietly shaped the recipes that entered written tradition. It turns out medieval cooking was less about inspiration and more about management. Most noble or wealthy households in medieval Europe had a steward or kitchen master. Someone tasked with ordering food, tracking stores, and making sure the household could feed itself through lean seasons, feast days, and religious fasts. A single manor might house 24 people, the noble family, servants, hired hands, and often guests. Feeding them wasn't a matter of throwing meat on a spit. It was a spreadsheet without the spreadsheet. When a 14th century household prepared a roast goose, the steward had to know how many geese were in the dovecote or on order from the market, whether this meal followed a fasting day and required dairy-free sides, whether bread from 3 days ago could be dried and used for pottage thickening, if saffron was running low, whether turmeric, known then as Indian saffron, might suffice. So when we read recipes like take a goose, roast him, and hew him in gobbets, and boil with onions and sage, what we're seeing is the end product. Behind that simple line are weeks of logistics. And when food was in short supply, leftovers became not just common, but essential. The kitchen master might log that meat for cold slicing on the venison scraps, salted and set to broth. Bone grease reserved for porree. A porree, an herbed, thickened green soup, could feed the household for 2 days. The same principle applied across ingredients. Boiled turnips became mash. Mash became filling. Leftover filling became fritters. Fritters, if burned or crumbled, could be added to barley soup. It sounds repetitive. It was repetitive. But in a world with erratic harvests and no refrigeration, this was resilience in practice. The kitchen ledger was not just a list. It was a survival plan. A day in the life of a medieval kitchen. To appreciate how food rotated, let's take a step into a typical kitchen from around 1380. It's morning. The fire's already been lit with coals from the night before. A pot of yesterday's barley porridge is still warm, just thick enough to be sliced and fried for breakfast. The cook opens the pantry. Dried herbs hang from beams. There are onions, wrinkled but usable, a crock of salted fish, and 2 cured hams nearing the end of their prime. Eggs sit in straw. The cheesecloth is tied tight over a basin of almond milk made the previous day. The steward's notes say a guest is arriving. That means today's stew should be enriched with the last of the beef stock and perhaps a dash of the expensive spice blend. Lunch will be a white stew, Chicken boiled and pulled apart, seasoned with sage and parsley, thickened with breadcrumbs, and finished with almond milk. Tonight's supper? That depends how much is left. The important thing is, nothing is wasted. Even the fat skimmed from boiled meat will be stored for future pastry dough. And through it all, the steward records: chicken consumed, broth reduced, sage supply noted as sparse. Cookbooks born from bored clerks. So how did all this end up in cookbooks? Simple. Sometimes a clerk got bored. Literally. While copying kitchen inventories, recipes might be noted in the margins. Instructions scribbled quickly in Latin or Middle English. Some appear like reminders. Add cinnamon to fish stew only on feast days. Others read like recipes shared among friends. Good for when the leeks are near spoilage. Must boil well. Over time, these notes accumulated, and when a household passed from one generation to the next, or when a nobleman sought to impress his peers, a more polished receipt book might be commissioned. Some recipe collections were written for posterity. Others were copied for training new kitchen staff. And others, possibly our favorites, were compiled simply because a steward thought, if I write this all down, maybe tomorrow will be easier. So why did these books survive at all? Unlike epic poems or legal texts, cookbooks weren't copied often. Most survived because they were bound together with other documents, accounting ledgers, prayer books, or land records. One famous medieval cookbook, the Liber de Coquina, survives today because it was copied onto the back of a theological treatise. Another was tucked inside a legal register of a bishopric. And that's what makes them so fascinating. These were not meant for show. They were used, annotated, smudged, rewritten. One 15th century page still shows a faint pink stain, possibly from wine or beetroot or a careless finger. The historian who examined it called it affectionately a splash of the medieval lunch hour. So, we end this section in the dim light of a medieval kitchen. A pot bubbles on the fire. A boy peels onions. The steward sharpens his quill and flips through yesterday's notes. Tomorrow's dinner depends on what's left today. And thanks to people like him, people who wrote everything down, we have not only the recipes, but the rhythms of a forgotten world. In the next section, we'll explore how religious calendars, fasting rules, and feast days shaped the recipes themselves, and how fish pies, faux meats, and meatless sausages reveal a world of ingenious culinary workarounds. Imagine you're living in a monastery in 1292. It's Lent. You haven't touched meat in over a week. Butter is off limits, milk forbidden. But there's a feast coming, St. Benedict's Day. You want something hearty, celebratory, and just a little indulgent. So what do you cook? The answer, found in more than one medieval recipe book, is something wonderfully absurd: false bacon. Constructed of minced almonds, breadcrumbs, and a dash of beetroot for color, this meatless marvel is shaped like a bacon strip and lightly fried. The result? A spiritual loophole on a plate, one that technically follows the fasting rules while emotionally fulfilling a carnivorous craving. This wasn't an isolated quirk. Across medieval Europe, religious observance didn't just dictate when people ate, it transformed what they ate. And in that transformation, we find the origins of some of the most creative, peculiar, and surprisingly modern food hacks in history. In medieval Christendom, The year was a revolving door of fasts and feasts. The church calendar ruled all: Advent, Lent, Ember Days, Rogation Days, Saints' Days, and more fast eves than any peasant could easily remember. The general rule: no meat, no animal fat, no dairy. On stricter fast days, even eggs were forbidden. Now that's manageable for a week or two, but Lent lasted 40 days, and combined with other observances, up to a third of the year was meat-free, so cooks, particularly in monasteries and noble houses, had to get inventive. That's when the fun began. Medieval cooks were masters of simulation. Need something meaty on a Friday? Almond milk and spiced breadcrumbs became your tools. Here are just a few documented tricks from the period. Meatless sausage, boiled rice mashed with saffron and raisins, stuffed into fish skins and roasted to resemble pork sausages. Fish that wasn't fish, a dish made from pounded nuts, rice flour, and parsley, shaped like a trout and painted with vegetable-based inks to mimic scales. Faux eggs, hard-boiled egg yolks hollowed and refilled with pureed fish and herbs, then sealed with a coating of waxy almond fat. One recipe even instructs the cook to mold a roast peacock entirely out of fish paste, place it on a platter with the original peacock feathers, and serve it as a conversation piece. It is not meat, the note insists, and may be taken on Friday. These meals weren't just tricks. They were acts of devotion and, often, artistry. Why go to all that trouble? On the surface, it seems ridiculous. Why spend hours sculpting fake bacon? Because food wasn't just nourishment, it was ritual. Breaking the rules meant breaking faith, but following them too plainly risked another sin: sloth. Bland pottage every day wasn't spiritually uplifting, so cooks, particularly in religious houses, saw these recipes as challenges. They asked,
In wealthy homes, especially during Lent, hosts would throw lavish, meatless banquets. Entire tables were covered with elaborate dishes that looked rich but adhered to church rules. Almond cheese, lentil roasts, simulated hams made from mashed chickpeas. Even the drink mattered. Ale was considered acceptable, but rich wines were sometimes seen as too indulgent unless watered down or served with humility. One note reads simply, "Watered wine to keep conscience quiet." A nun and her invented delicacies. Some of the cleverest recipes we have come from convent kitchens. Nuns in medieval Europe were often among the best educated women of their time. They kept gardens, tended bees, and brewed beer. And when it came to fasting days, they showed particular ingenuity. One 14th century collection attributed to a Benedictine convent includes fried apples in fish broth, served cold and rolled in spiced oats. Imitation kidney pie, a mix of onions, sage, and pureed mushrooms in a barley crust. And yes, almond bacon, pressed and pan-fried with a glaze of honey vinegar. These weren't meals of desperation. They were thoughtful, reflective, and meant to elevate the spirit as well as the palate. What do these recipes tell us? You begin to see how medieval food was not bad or bland in the way it's sometimes portrayed. It was complex, regulated, regional, and often deeply human. Because under all the fast day substitutions and soup thickeners lies a very familiar emotion.
I want something satisfying, and I can't have it, so I'll make something like it. It's the same instinct that leads to modern cauliflower crusts, soy-based meats, or vegan cheese. But unlike today's packaged solutions, medieval cooks had only what they could grow, gather, or grind. So they innovated, not just out of necessity, but out of joy. Many of these recipes were clearly meant to impress guests or delight fellow monks. A 15th century note next to one fish pie recipe reads, "If the Lord smiles, serve it again." Food.
You wake just before dawn. The courtyard is already full of whispering sounds. The rustling of mulberry leaves, the low thrum of boiling water, and the shuffling feet of neighbors moving quietly. The silkworms are hungry again. In the sericulture towns of the Han Dynasty, tending worms wasn't a once-in-a-while task. It was an all-consuming rhythm of life. There were few days off, no loud noises, and almost no rest during the warmer months. But there was purpose, and at times a strange sort of reverence for the tiny, delicate creatures that, if carefully nurtured, might spin enough thread to make cloth fit for a prince or a tax collector. This is the story of the silk towns. Quiet, humid, and often anonymous, these places fed an empire, not with rice or soldiers, but with shimmering thread that moved westward by the bolt and filled imperial coffers with gold. The humble beginnings of sericulture. By the time of the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE, silk production in China had already been around for at least 1,000 years. Legend credits Empress Lei Zhu, wife of the Yellow Emperor, with discovering how to unravel a cocoon after one dropped into her teacup. Whether that's true or not, by Han times, the process had become refined, regulated, and regionally specialized. Silk towns clustered along the middle and lower reaches of the Yangtze River, where mulberry trees grew thick and the air was warm and wet enough for the worms to thrive. These weren't cities in the grand sense, more like tightly organized clusters of homes, work sheds, and quiet courtyards, where dozens of families might spend months doing the same task: growing silk. It began with the trees. The sacred mulberry tree. Not just any leaves would do. Sericulture required the leaves of the white mulberry, Morus alba, a plant so central to the trade that many towns simply referred to their work as mulberry work. Families often had small groves of trees, and in wealthier towns, entire hillsides were planted with nothing but mulberry rows, pruned and plucked with great care. Harvesting the leaves was mostly women's work, usually younger girls or elderly grandmothers. The worms were fed 4 to 8 times per day, depending on their age, and their growth was rapid.
Within a month, they ballooned from specks no bigger than sesame seeds to fat, pale creatures the size of a pinky finger. And then, just when they seemed to do nothing but eat, they began to spin. Spinning gold. The act of cocooning was oddly mesmerizing. The worms lifted their heads in slow circles, excreting a clear, sticky fluid that hardened into silk fiber. It was a slow-motion dance, repeated thousands of times in each household. Each cocoon was the product of around 300,000 turns of the worm's head, spun over 3 days. Once spun, the worms would be allowed to rest, but not for long. If the worm was allowed to fully metamorphose into a moth, it would break out of the cocoon, tearing the thread. This rendered the silk nearly useless for high-quality weaving, so the cocoons had to be boiled, gently usually, but with full understanding of what the process entailed. A pot of water, held just below boiling. The cocoons were stirred with a bundle of twigs until the ends of the silk threads came loose. Then, slowly, carefully, the thread was reeled off, often over small spinning wheels turned by hand. They could take dozens of cocoons to make a single length of usable silk thread. For the families, it was a balancing act between care and sacrifice. Too rough, and the thread would tangle. Too slow, and the worm might break free. The process was, like the town itself, measured, careful, and almost ritualistic. Work that built an empire. Though quiet, these towns were not insignificant. Silk was more than just a luxury good. It was a currency. Taxes were sometimes paid in silk. Government officials were paid with bolts of silk. And diplomatic missions, especially those sent west toward the so-called barbarian lands, were carried not with gold, but with silk. Han envoys brought silk to Persia, to India, and beyond. By the 1st century CE, Roman women wore Chinese silk, and Roman senators grumbled that it made them too revealing. Yet few of those draped in its shimmer had any idea where it came from. Even within China, the details were often left out of official records. After all, who wanted to write about worms? Life in the silk towns followed a quiet cycle. The worms had to be raised in spring and early summer. The eggs were kept dormant through the winter, usually rolled in ash or kept cool in clay jars until the next season. Girls were taught from a young age how to harvest, sort, and spin. Boys often helped
So here you are, one of the 20-some satraps of the mighty Achaemenid Empire. Your territory stretches across fertile plains and dry hills. Your palace is stocked with tribute from a dozen subject peoples, and your servants whisper your name with reverence. But every time you hear hoofbeats coming up the royal road, your stomach tightens just a little. You know what's coming. A letter sealed with the golden emblem of Darius, or later Xerxes, or Artaxerxes, or whichever long-bearded ruler currently sits in Susa. You'll be expected to read it immediately, carry out its orders precisely, and respond with updates using the same courier system. And while the road has granted you power, reach, and access, it has also tethered you to a central authority that notices everything. The danger of knowing too quickly. Speedy communication was a two-edged sword. Yes, it helped squash revolts, collect taxes, and unify policy across a multicultural empire. But it also meant there was very little wiggle room for local autonomy. Satraps couldn't claim ignorance. They couldn't delay action by pretending they hadn't received the king's orders.
and they couldn't quietly line their pockets with silver without someone eventually finding out, because information now traveled with astonishing efficiency. Some governors found clever ways around this. A few, like the satrap Megabyzus of Syria, rebelled outright. Others became masters of the slow response, feigning illness, reporting vague weather troubles that kept roads impassable, or sending couriers with deliberately garbled versions of royal decrees. You couldn't stop the system, but you could jam it, just a little. Rebellion by relay. The Persian postal system was designed to suppress insurrection, but at least twice in its long history, it became the very mechanism by which rebellion was coordinated. Take the revolt of Cyrus the Younger in the 4th century BCE, when he tried to seize the throne from his brother King Artaxerxes II. Cyrus was a satrap himself, overseeing Lydia and Phrygia, key western regions with access to roads, wealth, and troops. Rather than moving openly at first, Cyrus used the imperial communication routes to quietly coordinate troop movements under the guise of defending the empire's western front. His letters to fellow satraps were vague but friendly. He leveraged the very system meant to prevent treason to organize one of the most audacious coups in Persian history. It failed, of course, famously so, during the Battle of Cunaxa, but it revealed a central irony of the royal road. Control and subversion were never more than a saddle apart. The role of road keepers. To counter this, the empire
Once entered into the state's ledgers that silk belonged to the empire, and the empire had plans for it. The quiet thunder of the trade caravans. Trade routes in the Han dynasty were neither single nor direct. The so-called Silk Road was more of a web, a series of shifting paths, river crossings, desert trails, and mountain passes. And silk traveled nearly all of them. The westernmost city of the Han realm, Dunhuang, was a vital waypoint. Nestled at the edge of the Gobi Desert, it served as both a gateway and a pause, a place where caravans regrouped, stocked up on supplies, and prayed to survive the Taklamakan. Silk caravans varied in size. Some were massive, with dozens of camels or carts. Others were just a handful of traders and mules. The cloth was bundled tightly in oilcloth to keep it dry, wrapped in straw or leather, and tied with care. If you stood in the desert wind and watched them pass, you'd see the bolts bobbing like sleeping children, stacked on the backs of animals that had no idea they were carrying treasure. Traveling merchants used silk as both cargo and currency. In towns with no coinage, a strip of silk might buy you food, protection, or passage. The value depended on quality, pattern, and thickness, but even the humblest bolt held weight. By the early 1st century CE, Chinese silk had reached lands that no Han official had ever seen. In India, it was used to wrap sacred statues. In Parthia, it adorned the nobility. And in Rome, where silk was both coveted and condemned, it made its way into the wardrobes of patrician women and actors alike. Roman philosophers complained about it. Seneca the Younger scorned it as garments that do not hide the body, while Pliny the Elder grumbled about its cost and its foreignness. The Senate once tried to ban it, but they kept buying. Rome didn't know where silk came from. The Parthians, the middlemen of the ancient world, kept the secret. They claimed it came from trees, from mystery islands, from gods. The further silk traveled, the more its origins faded into fog. All the while, back in Han China, the girls who fed the worms never heard about Rome, nor would they have cared. The reach of silk extended beyond fashion. Han emperors used it to cement alliances,
reward generals, and smooth diplomacy. A gift of 100 bolts of silk could make a border chieftain think twice about rebellion. It could buy horses, favor, even loyalty, if only temporarily. The famed envoy Zhang Chen, during his expeditions west, paved the way for official trade with Central Asia. His journeys helped link China.
Silk in this way became part of the lifeblood of the Han Dynasty, not just as a product, but as a tool of statecraft. Smugglers, saboteurs, and the forbidden thread. For centuries, China guarded the secrets of silk production. Exporting raw cocoons or silkworm eggs was strictly forbidden. Sericulture was state knowledge, handed down but never handed out. Travelers who left the empire were searched. Rumors abounded of smugglers who tried to sneak out eggs in bamboo canes or sewn into garments. Some were caught and punished, others disappeared into history. The secrecy wasn't just paranoia, it was protection. Silk gave China leverage, prestige, and economic power. The longer no one else could replicate it, the longer China could dominate the market. It wasn't until centuries later, long after the fall of the Han, that silk production spread beyond its borders, and even then it took espionage, bribes, and brave monks with hidden eggs. But for now, in the height of the Han Dynasty, the thread remained pure, woven at home, traded abroad, revered everywhere. Endless miles, silent journeys. It's easy to picture the desert as empty, but along the Silk Roads it hummed with quiet purpose. The tread of camels, the shuffle of merchant feet, the clink of leather-wrapped parcels. Silk didn't travel quickly, but it traveled far. Far enough that a robe in Rome might once have been touched by a girl in a Yangtze courtyard who never raised her voice around the worms. And as those bolts crossed mountain passes and river valleys, they carried with them a world of silence, labor, and patient spinning, wrapped in oilcloth, riding on the wind. In our final section, we'll return to the silk towns to meet the women who rose through the ranks of their craft, the inspectors who tested cloth with clever techniques, and the afterlives of silk, ritual burials, heirlooms, and legends. If you've been imagining the silk towns of Han China as quiet little places full of worms and whispering women, you're not far off. But you might be underestimating something important: power. Silk wasn't just a trade good. It was also a path. For those who mastered the delicate balance of worm raising, spinning, and weaving, silk could offer something rare in pre-modern life: mobility. Not necessarily geographic mobility. You probably weren't going to pack your loom and head off to Chang'an, but social mobility. Influence, even in small doses. Respect. Let's return to one of these towns now. Not as a merchant or tax officer, but as someone who knows the work inside and out. Someone with calloused fingers, a trained eye, and a reputation. Let's visit a master of silk, the mistress of the loom. She might not be famous beyond her village, but everyone here knows her name. She oversees a team of workers, mostly younger women, some of whom are her daughters or nieces. They gather in the long workshop at dawn, and the air is already full of the soft shh of thread on wood. Her loom is larger than most, and she's modified it herself over the years, adding little improvements, smoothing corners, tying on extra weights. When she talks, people listen. She can identify silk grades by touch alone. She's the one who decides which cloths are fit for sale and which must be unraveled and respun. Unlike most people in this town, she owns her own mulberry grove. A small one, yes, but enough to give her independence. Her worms are famous for spinning longer filaments. She feeds them regularly, plays them music, yes, really, a soft zither that she swears keeps them calm, and never lets them grow agitated. In the spinning season, she barely sleeps. But when the tax inspectors arrive, she's always ready. Inspectors, testing, and the art of being unimpressed.
Han Dynasty officials who dealt with silk had a problem. How do you ensure that the thousands of bolts being submitted across the empire are actually good? There were no barcodes or factories. Every piece of cloth had to be judged by human senses: touch, sight, and occasionally smell. Some officials used small burn tests, taking a corner of the cloth and setting it alight. True silk burned slowly and smelled faintly like burning hair. Linen or fakes crisped up and left ash. Others tested thread strength. A thin strand pulled from the edge would be stretched slowly, sometimes around 2 fingers, sometimes on a hooked rod. A good thread would stretch, shimmer, and snap with a clean break. A bad one would fray or come apart too easily. Weights were taken, of course. Bolts had to meet a standard mass. Sometimes bolts were padded to fake the weight, a trick that rarely fooled the experienced inspectors, who would unroll the entire bolt and check for irregular stitching. The mistress of the If she was lucky, and she usually was, she'd receive an extra token from the local magistrate. A small ceramic slip stamped with an official seal, acknowledging quality above quota. These tokens were quietly prized, though never boasted about. Silk and status. When cloth becomes currency in Han China, silk wasn't just traded. It was worn with coded intent. Each pattern, thread count, and color bore meaning. Higher-ranking officials were allowed certain colors and weaves. Yellow, for example, was reserved for the imperial family. Commoners caught wearing restricted styles could face fines or confiscation. But within a household, silk could also mark transitions. A young woman preparing to marry might be gifted bolts of silk, part of her dowry. These weren't just practical cloths, they were a sign that her family had means, that she would go to her new household prepared and well-dressed. For the silk makers themselves, being known as the source of such dowry cloth was a quiet form of status. Your work traveled farther than you did. Your patterns entered other people's stories. And for the few who earned enough to commission fine robes for their own use, robes they might wear at a festival or for ancestor rites, the feeling was more than pride. It was presence, being seen in one's own craft. Silk's final destination, tombs and time capsules. Some of the finest examples of Han Dynasty silk weren't found in market stalls or court halls. They were found underground. In tombs from the 2nd century BCE, archaeologists have discovered silk garments so finely made they rival anything produced today. Delicate gauze robes, sometimes folded with precision and packed beside the deceased. These burial robes weren't always worn in life. Some were made specifically for death, a final statement of identity, status, and dignity. Silk was believed to protect. Its luster, its purity, its softness, all made it an ideal material for shrouds. Even the poorest families, if they could manage it, might bury their dead with a scrap of silk cloth or thread tied around the wrist. In the afterlife imagined by Han belief, appearance mattered. Ancestral spirits were honored with gifts, and a well-dressed spirit was a well-respected one. In the Mawangdui tombs near Changsha, one noble woman was buried with more than 100 garments, robes, slippers, sashes, all made of silk, and many bearing the marks of high craftsmanship. Some had even been labeled in tiny brushstrokes with notes like "winter robe" or "not to be worn until autumn." Instructions from the living to the dead. The sound of
So here you are, one of the 20-some satraps of the mighty Achaemenid Empire. Your territory stretches across fertile plains and dry hills. Your palace is stocked with tribute from a dozen subject peoples,
and your servants whisper your name with reverence. But every time you hear hoofbeats coming up the royal road, your stomach tightens just a little. You know what's coming. A letter sealed with the golden emblem of Darius, or later Xerxes, or Artaxerxes, or whichever long-bearded ruler currently sits in Susa. You'll be expected to read it immediately, carry out its orders precisely, and respond with updates using the same courier system. And while the road has granted you power, reach, and access, it has also tethered you to a central authority that notices everything. The danger of knowing too quickly. Speedy communication was a two-edged sword. Yes, it helped squash revolts, collect taxes, and unify policy across a multicultural empire. But it also meant there was very little wiggle room for local autonomy. Satraps couldn't claim ignorance. They couldn't delay action by pretending they hadn't received the king's orders, and they couldn't quietly line their pockets with silver without someone eventually finding out, because information now traveled with astonishing efficiency. Some governors found clever ways around this. A few, like the satrap Megabyzus of Syria, rebelled outright. Others became masters of the slow response, feigning illness, reporting vague weather troubles that kept roads impassable, or sending couriers with deliberately garbled versions of royal decrees. You couldn't stop the system, but you could jam it, just a little. Rebellion by relay. The Persian postal system was designed to suppress insurrection, but at least twice in its long history, it became the very mechanism by which rebellion was coordinated. Take the revolt of Cyrus the Younger in the 4th century BCE, when he tried to seize the throne from his brother King Artaxerxes II. Cyrus was a satrap himself, overseeing Lydia and Phrygia, key western regions with access to roads, wealth, and troops. Rather than moving openly at first, Cyrus used the imperial communication routes to quietly coordinate troop movements under the guise of defending the empire's western front. His letters to fellow satraps were vague but friendly. He leveraged the very system meant to prevent treason to organize one of the most audacious coups in Persian history. It failed, of course, famously so, during the Battle of Cunaxa, but it revealed a central irony of the royal road. Control and subversion were never more than a saddle apart. The role of road keepers. To counter this, the empire—
It's about the hum of spinning wheels, the creak of looms, the splash of dye pots, and the rustle of finished cloth, folded just so. Even now, when you look at ancient Han silk underglass, you can still see the care. The tiny flaws where a spinner's hands trembled. The faint diagonal of a rushed weave. The difference in shade between two batches of dye. These are not mistakes. They're stories. And somewhere, deep in a tomb or buried beneath a collapsed wall, there may yet lie a spindle, silent now, but once the heart of an empire's most mysterious and beautiful thread. Next, we'll explore the curious history of a city that supposedly banned clocks altogether for over 300 years. But for now, rest easy. History isn't going anywhere. You arrive in the city just after dawn, guided by the sound of rustling cypress trees and the gentle trickle of water from public fountains. The morning is slow, the sun gentle. You glance around for a clock, but you won't find one. This is Bursa, an Ottoman town nestled at the foot of Mount Uludağ, famous for silk, mystics, and, curiously, its complicated relationship with time. Not time as an abstract idea. Bursa was never timeless, but time as a tool, a thing you could nail to a wall and watch march on. For generations, this city refused to let mechanical clocks take root. Not out of ignorance, not because they couldn't afford them, but because time, according to the city's elders, mystics, and even its weavers, belonged to God, not gears. Let's begin where time once began, with shadow. Telling time before clocks ticked. In early Ottoman Bursa, long before clocks arrived from Europe, time was marked by light. The city was peppered with sundials, some carved into marble mosque walls, others set on pedestals in courtyards. These were no mere decorations. They were calibrated with care. The angle of the gnomon, the sundial's shadow-casting arm, had to match the city's latitude. Some dials showed only prayer times, Fajr, Dur, Ar, Maghrib, Isha. Others marked hours more roughly, dawn, mid-morning, afternoon, near sunset. Each morning, a man would step out to check the dial and adjust his schedule accordingly. He might be a muezzin preparing to call the faithful to prayer, or a silk dyer, checking if he had enough light to complete a color run. Everyone knew that the hours varied by season. The length of an Ottoman hour could shift from day to day, longer in summer, shorter in winter. But that was natural. That was God's time, not man's. For most of Bursa's history, that was enough. Enter the European clock and the problem of precision. Sometime in the late 1500s, a strange object arrived in Bursa. It was small and heavy, made of brass, and ticking faintly inside its wooden box. It was a mechanical clock, likely imported from Italy or the German states. Perhaps a merchant brought it, or a curious scholar. No one remembers exactly. What we do know is that the clock caused unease. Here was a device that divided time equally, regardless of season. A device that told you when an hour had passed, even if it didn't feel like it had. It kept going after sunset. It kept going in storms. It kept going when the muezzin hesitated. It was, in a quiet way, defiant. Religious scholars in Bursa debated the device. Some saw it as useful, perhaps even admirable,
An hour by the water clock.
instead of embracing mechanical clocks. Bursa leaned into another tradition, the clepsydra or water clock. At the center of the city near the Green Mosque, there once stood a tower-like structure where water trickled slowly from a copper bowl into a series of calibrated basins. Each basin marked a fraction of the day, and as they filled, they tipped and rang a small bell or chime. Monks in earlier centuries had used water clocks to measure monastic hours. The Ottomans, ever practical, adapted them to fit prayer schedules, market openings, and irrigation rotations. The water clock didn't tick. It gurgled. It whispered. It was a slower keeper of time, and that suited the city's pace. Famous silk guilds even used a water clock to determine dyeing intervals. Certain colors, deep crimson, peacock blue, required exact immersion times. Apprentices were trained to listen for the chime, rather than consult a dial. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, of a silk master who once threw a clock into the river, muttering that gears have no scent. That may be a fable, but it says something true about the town's sentiment. Waiting for the call to prayer. In this period, time in Bursa was personal. You didn't look at a clock. You listened. The 5 daily calls to prayer acted like temporal anchors. You knew when it was midday, not by the sun's height or a chiming bell, but by the voice of the muezzin echoing through the air. In fact, in some quarters of Bursa, especially near the textile district, The start of work was not fixed by the hour, but by the second prayer of the day. Weavers would arrive at their looms once the Dora call rang out, and they'd close shop at Maghrib when the sun bowed to the horizon. You can imagine how quiet the night was in such a place. No tick-tocks, no winding springs, only the wind through mulberry leaves, the soft footfall of cats, and the muffled prayers of late-working scholars. There is something to be said for not knowing the exact minute. A city suspended in slowness. So the clocks came, and the clocks stayed silent. Foreign travelers to Bursa often found this charming or maddening, depending on their temperament. One 18th century French merchant complained in his diary, "This town refuses to agree on a common hour. The barber opens when he pleases, the tailor drifts in past mid-morning, and I waited for soup until sunset." But to the people of Bursa, this was normal. Time was marked by routine, not by bells. The baker knew when the dough was ready by touch, not by schedule.
So here you are, one of the 20-some satraps of the mighty Achaemenid Empire. Your territory stretches across fertile plains and dry hills. Your palace is stocked with tribute from a dozen subject peoples, and your servants whisper your name with reverence. But every time you hear hoofbeats coming up the royal road, your stomach tightens just a little. You know what's coming. A letter sealed with the golden emblem of Darius, or later Xerxes, or Artaxerxes, or whichever long-bearded ruler currently sits in Susa. You'll be expected to read it immediately, carry out its orders precisely, and respond with updates using the same courier system. And while the road has granted you power, reach, and access, it has also tethered you to a central authority that notices everything. The danger of knowing too quickly. Speedy communication was a two-edged sword. Yes, it helped squash revolts, collect taxes, and unify policy across a multicultural empire. But it also meant there was very little wiggle room for local autonomy. Satraps couldn't claim ignorance. They couldn't delay action by pretending they hadn't received the king's orders, and they couldn't quietly line their pockets with silver without someone eventually finding out, because information now traveled with astonishing efficiency. Some governors found clever ways around this. A few, like the satrap Megabyzus of Syria, rebelled outright. Others became masters of the slow response, feigning illness, reporting vague weather troubles that kept roads impassable, or sending couriers with deliberately garbled versions of royal decrees. You couldn't stop the system, but you could jam it, just a little. Rebellion by relay. The Persian postal system was designed to suppress insurrection, but at least twice in its long history, it became the very mechanism by which rebellion was coordinated. Take the revolt of Cyrus the Younger in the 4th century BCE, when he tried to seize the throne from his brother King Artaxerxes II. Cyrus was a satrap himself, overseeing Lydia and Phrygia, key western regions with access to roads, wealth, and troops. Rather than moving openly at first, Cyrus used the imperial communication routes to quietly coordinate troop movements under the guise of defending the empire's western front. His letters to fellow satraps were vague but friendly. He leveraged the very system meant to prevent treason to organize one of the most audacious coups in Persian history. It failed, of course, famously so, during the Battle of Cunaxa, but it revealed a central irony of the royal road. Control and subversion were never more than a saddle apart. The role of road keepers. To counter this, the empire
It's about the hum of spinning wheels, the creak of looms,
the splash of dye pots and the rustle of finished cloth folded just so. Even now, when you look at ancient Han silk underglass, you can still see the care. The tiny flaws where a spinner's hands trembled, the faint diagonal of a rushed weave, the difference in shade between two batches of dye. These are not mistakes. They're stories. And somewhere, deep in a tomb or buried beneath a collapsed wall, there may yet lie a spindle, silent now, but once the heart of an empire's most mysterious and beautiful thread. Next, we'll explore the curious history of a city that supposedly banned clocks altogether for over 300 years. But for now, rest easy. History isn't going anywhere. Even the songs of birds acted as timekeepers. Swallows heralded the approach of Asr. Owls signaled Isha. Children were taught not to look at shadows, but to listen for birdsong. Certain smells also marked time. The roasting of chestnuts meant Maghrib was near. The boiling of quince jam, made only in certain months, indicated that it was almost time for the cold winds off Uluda to begin. In this sense, Bursa's calendar was not linear but layered, scented, and sung. Clock resistance in a changing world. By the late 1700s, Ottoman officials had begun to promote standardized time, especially in port cities and administrative centers. European influence crept in with pocket watches, railway timetables, and military drills. But in Bursa, resistance was gentle and strangely effective. Many homes refused to hang clocks. Those that did often let them wind down quietly. Some families covered them with scarves so as not to see the ticking hands during prayer. There are tales of weddings postponed because a clock was found to be running ahead of the prayer schedule. In one family record, a grandmother was said to refuse to eat if the clock on the wall struck during a meal. "It interrupts digestion," she reportedly said. This wasn't anti-technology. Bursa had workshops, foreign books, a vibrant trade. But it was, perhaps, a form of spiritual timekeeping. A refusal to be ruled by a machine that couldn't feel wind or hear a muezzin. Still, the tower ticked on. Of course, change came eventually. The clock tower installed in 1906 remained controversial for years. At first, no one listened to it. It chimed pointlessly into the morning air. Gradually, some began to nod at it, then check it, then meet at 1/2 the hour instead of after the second call to prayer. School teachers were among the first to convert to mechanical timekeeping. Trains and telegraphs followed. The silk guilds held out longest. But even by the 1930s, many in Bursa still structured their day by shadows. One old merchant, when interviewed in 1941, said, "I keep a watch in my pocket, but I check the sun to be sure it's honest." So we pause again, wondering, if all your hours were ruled by... A narrow alley winds behind the Green Moss complex.
silent except for the faint rustle of fig leaves. You follow its gentle incline, stepping over cobblestones smoothed by centuries of sandals and soft-soled shoes. At the end of the alley, a weathered wooden door stands ajar. This was once the room of the Mawakit, the man who knew when to pray, when to work, and when to rest, based only on the shape of shadows and the wisdom of the stars. It is empty now, but a faint groove on the windowsill still suggests where a sundial once rested. Bursa's timekeepers, once vital, almost sacred figures, are now only footnotes in city records. But the change didn't happen all at once, and it wasn't without a few final acts of quiet rebellion. Today, we conclude the story of how Bursa slowly surrendered to the clock and what was lost in the ticking. A tower that didn't know the seasons. The famous Bursa clock tower, erected in the early 20th century, became a symbol of modernization and for many the end of an era. It was built not by a local guild, but by state officials, engineers from Istanbul who brought with them standardized hour plates and imported German clockwork. The tower was four-sided, visible from nearly every corner of the old city. It chimed on the hour, every hour. But there was a problem. The tower was wrong, or rather it was right, mechanically, mathematically, and astronomically. But it wasn't true to Bursa's old way of marking the day. The prayer calls, recalculated daily based on solar movement, didn't line up with the chimes. Work rhythms remained tethered to nature, not numbered dials. So for decades, the city operated on dual systems, the ancient and the modern, shadow and gear, Mawakit and mechanism. How to delay a revolution, tricks of the quiet clock. Some of Bursa's older citizens developed subtle strategies for ignoring mechanical time. A few families would deliberately set their home clocks 5 prayers late. Others hung curtain cloth over clock faces, as if the ticking thing needed to be shielded from the light. Children were taught polite ways of ignoring watch-wearers. If someone asked, "What time is it?" they might respond, "I think Asr is soon." One silk mill owner reportedly rigged the factory bell to ring based on the muezzin's call, not the hour hand. When inspectors came, he would discreetly disconnect the bell rope and show them the perfectly punctual wall clock in his office, then quietly reconnect it once they left. Even shop signs resisted change. Barber hours were still listed as from Dhuhr to Maghrib, well into the 1950s. The last Mawakit of Bursa. His name was Hafiz Saleh, and he served at the...
Though his role had become largely ceremonial, people still trusted him more than the tower. "He knew when to call," said a grocer who remembered him. "The tower only knew when to chime." When Saleh died, the position of Mawakit was not refilled. Instead, prayer times were calculated by central religious offices and printed on leaflets. The Green Mosque timekeeper's room was sealed and forgotten. Time had become a matter of numbers again. Sound, silence, and the shift in daily life. One of the less obvious results of time standardization was the disappearance of ambient sound as a signal. In the old Bursa, the day had its own sonic choreography. Water sellers rang bells at dawn. Bread vendors clacked wooden spoons at noon. A woman rinsing lentils in a courtyard basin created a rhythm that echoed through adjoining homes, signaling that lunch was on its way. These small sounds, unique to time and place, acted as social timekeepers. But with clocks came isolation. Families began to eat on individualized schedules. Work started at 9, not when the fig leaves stopped dripping. Bells and birdsong became background noise instead of cues. In the 1970s, one anthropologist noted that children no longer knew how to measure shadow lengths. A local school even removed a sundial from its courtyard, calling it no longer useful. Time had become not just standardized, but also quieter, mechanical, private. Yet some rhythms remained. Today, if you walk through the Kozahan, the old silk market, you can still see merchants opening their stalls not at 8 a.m. sharp, but when the birds arrive. Some bakers still time their dough by the cooling of coals. A few elders insist on breaking their fast at the exact moment the muezzin's call echoes off a particular fountain wall. Old habits die slowly, even in the shadow of modernity. During Ramadan, families still cluster around balconies to watch the sky instead of checking a digital app. And some gardeners plant according to the lunar calendar, saying, "The old ways grow sweeter figs." The clock has conquered the city, but the soul of slow time lingers. Reflections in still water. So what did Bursa lose when it gained the clock? Not efficiency, surely. The trains run on time now, doctors keep appointments, school children file in by the bell. But it lost something else, something harder to measure. A sense of shared time, of listening together for a call, of watching the day unfold through light and scent and birdsong, rather than numbers on a glowing screen. Today, we live in a world where every moment is accounted for. But what if you were told the time by the warmth of stone, or the smell of quince, or the curve of your own shadow? What if time was something you felt, not something you watched tick away? Would your days be shorter?
You wake beneath a paper screen, the faint scent of cedar clinging to the air. Beyond the door, a courtyard garden rests under a blanket of snow, so fine it seems sifted by a divine hand. A pine branch bends, not under weight, but under aesthetic suggestion. It is winter in Heian, Japan. The year is 1012. You are a court attendant, assigned not to military drills or grain accounting, but to the far more delicate task of observing snowfall and, perhaps, if the snow proves sufficiently graceful, composing a short verse about it. This is a world where quiet is a virtue, idleness is ritualized, and beauty itself holds bureaucratic value. Here, poetry was not entertainment. It was the currency of social life, and snowfall, fleeting, precise, and emotionally resonant, was its highest form. Welcome to the most elegantly uneventful job in imperial history, seasonal poetry monitoring. The bureaucracy of stillness. At the height of the Heian period, the Japanese court was governed not just by codes of law, but by a dense, almost theatrical etiquette system. Every action was infused with meaning: how you folded a letter, what kind of paper you used, the perfume burned beneath it. And among the hundreds of court positions, one of the most curious was the Yuki no Kanshin, the snow observer. This was not a weatherman in the modern sense. The snow observer had no barometers, no predictions, and absolutely no interest in accumulation data. His duty was aesthetic. Each morning in winter, he would quietly walk through the imperial gardens, observing how the snow settled. On plums, on reeds, along the edge of stone lanterns. He would then submit a brief poetic report to the court's senior ministers, and sometimes to the emperor himself. A snow report might read, "On the bridge rail, the snow folds its arms and waits. Not yet spring, not yet still." If the poem pleased the emperor, it might be copied by scribes and circulated among nobles, each recipient expected to send back a reply verse by nightfall. In this way, snowfall was not merely observed, it was participated in, a shared meditation, a form of lightly codified public feeling, snow as a social event. In the Heian court, almost any atmospheric change could be elevated to courtly ritual, but snow was special.
It marked a kind of seasonal stillness, a permission slip for introspection. When the first snow fell, official schedules were quietly altered, meetings were canceled, public appearances deferred, ministers and ladies-in-waiting retreated into their rooms, where they were expected to compose at least one suitable verse and share it within their circles. For example, a lady might write, "Snow on the steps."
Among court women especially, snow poems became subtle declarations of mood, longing, or rivalry. You could express heartbreak not by naming a lover, but by describing the shape of snow melting off a pine branch, suggesting something once firm had finally given in. Snow provided cover for everything. The elegance of emotional weather. Heian poetry operated within incredibly strict forms, usually waka, with 31 syllables divided 5-7-5-7-7. But it was in these constraints that snow poetry flourished. Because the snow itself did not last, neither could the emotion. No one sent a poem about last week's snow. To describe it late was a faux pas, like weeping about a ghost already laid to rest. This encouraged immediacy, intimacy, and most of all, attention. A low-ranking attendant might spend the entire morning watching how snow gathered in a bronze basin just to find the correct verb. Did it drift, shiver, wait? The result was a society highly attuned to visual nuance, and through snow poems, that sensitivity became social glue. You learned about a rival's melancholy by how she described icicles. You read between lines for gossip. Even marriages began with snowfall verses exchanged between families, carefully vetted by go-betweens. And all of this was recorded, carefully, in scrolls still kept today. When it snowed too much. Of course, not all snow was poetic. Sometimes it was simply inconvenient. Servants complained of cold floors and endless sweeping. Messengers cursed blocked roads. Temple monks fretted over roof damage. But even these frustrations were filtered through aesthetic expression. In one document from 1005, a frustrated stable worker wrote, "Snow again. My horse eats more than I do. It prefers the fire." That poem, crudely phrased, sarcastic in tone, was considered so amusing that it was passed around court, with marginalia added by various nobles, one of whom annotated, "Clearly not trained in decorum but honest. Keep this one." In time, even workmen and village scribes were encouraged to submit snow poems. Though the court's taste remained aristocratic, it opened small windows to the wider world, common feelings, shared coldness, communal shivering. The empire became briefly united by one thing, snowfall, and the need to say something about it. But what did it mean? This is the central question of Heian snow poetry. Was the snow a metaphor, or was it just snow? To some, it was political, a veil. Today, we think of poetry as a personal art. But in Heian, Japan, especially with snow poetry, it was more like a public service. What you wrote about the snow shaped how others felt about the snow. And in that way, you helped write the season itself. In our next section, we'll explore what happened when poetry became political. When emperors used snowfall to silence dissent. And one winter verse was almost declared treason. You are once again within the cedar-scented quarters of the Heian court, though the snow now lies deeper. The gardens are silent, save for the soft creak of bamboo under white weight. Winter is no longer gentle.
The year is 1034, and the mood is frostier than usual, not because of the weather, but because of a poem. What was meant to be a short verse about snow on a temple roof has somehow been interpreted as subversive. And in a world where everything means something, this seemingly harmless waka has set off a chain reaction among ministers, ladies-in-waiting, and even the emperor himself. For the first time in recorded court history, someone may be punished for too much metaphor.
The offending poem. It began innocently, a poem read aloud during an evening poetry salon in the Empress's chamber was composed by a minor official known for his quiet manners and average handwriting. No one remembered his name. But they remembered the verse. The snow does not fall. It merely waits on the eaves, listening for news. Even stillness has ears here. Even silence can report. It was subtle, perhaps too subtle. To most it evoked the quietness of winter evenings, the way snowfall seemed to pause midair, the eerie attentiveness of stillness itself. But one of the senior ministers, Fujiwara no Sanemori, heard something else entirely. Surveillance, spying, a commentary on court informants and the growing paranoia among factions within the palace. Within hours, the poem had been copied, analyzed, and whispered over sake. Who was this poet? What exactly did he mean? Was the snow a metaphor for a silent coup? Suddenly, snow was no longer just snow. The perils of poetic ambiguity. Unlike political pamphlets or proclamations, poems were not required to make their meanings plain. In fact, the ambiguity was the point. Poets were prized for subtle allusions, historical references, and layered feelings. But that very ambiguity made them dangerous. Once the court began viewing waka through a political lens, everything became suspect. A verse about melting snow might imply corruption. A haiku about icicles might signal cold alliances. Entire salons were called just to interpret a single line. Ministers started to employ meaning readers, low-ranking courtiers with good memories and flexible imaginations who could scan poems for hints of sedition. One was rumored to have found a veiled insult against the emperor's calligraphy in a love poem comparing snowflakes to unbalanced strokes. Paranoia bloomed like plum blossoms in February. The gentle art of winter verse had become a minefield. The case of Lady Enshi. Perhaps no one suffered more from this cultural shift than Lady Enshi, a celebrated poet and third-rank consort to a former emperor. Enshi was known for her sharp seasonal poems, which always carried a hint of irony. One snowy evening she composed, "Snow covers the road to the old emperor's gate, but none sweep it clean. Time drifts in long sentences. Loyalty shortens in cold." To her friends, this was merely a commentary on her fading influence in court. But to the new empress's faction, it reeked of passive aggression. She was summoned, questioned, and confined to her quarters under the pretext of seasonal illness. The snow outside. How the emperor responded. The reigning emperor, Go-Ichijo, was a man of calm temperament. He enjoyed winter. He hosted silent walks in the snow, and he detested open conflict. When the snow poem crisis, as it was called behind closed doors, reached his ears, he did not issue punishments. Instead, he composed his own response poem, anonymously submitted to the poetry salon. If snow had a tongue, it would tell only of cold, not of ambition. Better to leave white footprints than stain what cannot be cleaned. It was a gentle rebuke, and yet unmistakable. The court quieted. The poem was copied to more than 40 scrolls. Tension melted, or at least refroze. No one was punished. Instead, a new etiquette was established. Do not use snow to speak too plainly.
The rise of officially sanctioned snow themes. To preserve the dignity of seasonal verse and avoid further misinterpretations, the court's poetry board, yes, there was one, issued a set of themes for winter poetry. These were called yukidai, snow topics, and included snow on thatched roofs, snow and absent lovers, snow on temple bells, the first snow on a monk's begging bowl, footprints vanishing behind courtiers. Poems deviating too far from these themes were politely discouraged or sent back with suggestions like, consider focusing more on scenery and less on political weather. Snow became snow again, but it had changed. It now wore the polite smile of compliance. Amidst this tension, an unexpected figure rose in prominence: the imperial papermaker. You see, snowy poems were often written on special winter-themed paper, blue-tinted mulberry with pressed mica flakes or hand-dyed sheets that mimicked snowfall. The designs subtly influenced tone. A stark white sheet suggested raw honesty. A pale gray one signaled sorrow. Yellow-tinted paper implied satire. When the snow poem crisis hit, poets began requesting ambiguous paper, designs so subtle they could mean anything or nothing. This gave them plausible deniability. And so, the papermaker became a kind of editorial consultant, a quiet gatekeeper of tone. By the end of winter, the papermaker's waiting list stretched for weeks. By the mid-11th century, Heian Japan had perfected the art of doing nothing beautifully. Snow poems had become an elaborate game of restraint, suggestion, and emotional camouflage. Every falling flake was a metaphor waiting to be deciphered, and possibly misinterpreted. And yet, through all the whispers and political theater, something endured: the attention. Because to write even a cautious snow poem, one still had to look, to sit still, to observe the precise way a snowdrift formed against a lacquered gate, or how it curled beneath a sandal print before.
The act of looking, that at least remained pure. But in our final section, we'll explore what happened when the snow stopped coming, how a run of warm winters challenged the court's poetry rituals and forced one reluctant poet to reinvent an entire season with ink and imagination. Imagine you're seated on a veranda of polished cypress wood, looking out across a pond that should be frozen. It is the 12th month of the lunar calendar, and the plums are budding too early. There should be snow, there should be silence. But instead, there is damp air, restless frogs, and distant temple bells echoing through a fog more fitting for late spring. It is the winter of 1041, and the snow has not arrived, a crisis of the calendar. For the Heian court, where the seasons provided both poetic material and spiritual equilibrium, this absence of snow was more than a weather anomaly. It was a disruption in cosmic order, a failure of the world to meet its aesthetic obligations. Winter poetry salons were still scheduled. Paper had been dyed in delicate shades of pearl and moon gray. Courtiers had spent weeks composing verses about falling snow they assumed would come. But when the snowfall failed to arrive, so too did inspiration. A few desperate attempts were made. Snow remains a thought, unfallen in the warm breeze, still imagined white. The response: tepid nods, slightly raised fans, a few discreet coughs. One lady in waiting whispered, "It feels like summer with a blanket on," a sentiment widely shared but never spoken aloud in front of the emperor. The problem of poetic obligation. You see, snow poems weren't optional. The court had rhythms to follow: solstice verses, New Year's verses, seasonal laments. The absence of snow meant either violating poetic tradition or writing fiction, which was considered, well, slightly vulgar. Nature, after all, was meant to inspire sincerity. To describe snow that didn't exist felt almost dishonest. And yet, the calendar insisted. So did the Ministry of Rights. Thus, the poets had a choice: abandon their beloved winter themes or invent them from whole cloth. This led to what is now called kanso-yuki, or imagined snow, a brief but fascinating literary experiment where Heian poets wrote about winters that had never happened. The invention of imagined snow. The pioneer of this movement was an unlikely figure, Fujiwara no Nagako, a mid-ranked court official known more for his fine handwriting than his verses. But with real snow failing him, Nagako took a radical approach. He invented a fake winter. Snow fell last night, heavy on the bent pines. I woke to none, but the hush in my slippers remembered what I had dreamed.
It was a breakthrough. His poem didn't lie about snowfall. It evoked the feeling of snow, a dream, a memory, a ghost of winter. Others followed. Soon poetry salons were filled with phantom snowstorms, imagined icicles, and fictional frost-bitten robes. A kind of surreal winter unfolded in verse, soft, melancholy, and oddly soothing. Some purists protested, but most accepted it. After all, sincerity wasn't always about facts. It was about feeling. Paper as climate control. As imagined snow poems gained traction, the paper artisans adapted. New designs featured snowflakes in abstraction, faint silver circles that looked like drifting breath, or blurred spirals meant to suggest fogged windows. One famous papermaker even pressed tiny grains of crushed pearl into sheets to create a glittering, intangible sheen, snow that never touched the ground. This emotional paper was used almost exclusively by court ladies who wrote poems about longing for snow as if it were a lost lover. You did not arrive, white guest who never stays long. I lit the brazier and named each crackle your step. Still, my sleeve stayed dry. The practical consequences of a warm winter. While the court invented snow, the outside world had more practical concerns. Rice seedlings were budding too early. The mountain roads remained muddy. Shrines that relied on snowmelt for purification rituals found their pools stagnant. In Kyoto's merchant quarters, tailors noted that fewer clients were ordering lined winter robes. The silk workers dependent on seasonal sales worried quietly. Still, the court pressed on. They performed winter rituals with powdered chalk and white-dyed rice husks. The New Year's archery ceremony was held in full regalia, sweating archers in fur-trimmed sleeves, fanning themselves behind closed fans. Even the emperor, still boyish and quiet, commented during one stroll in the garden, "The snow is late this year, but our hearts remain on time." A final poem and a lesson in letting go. At the end of that winter, Nagako, the poet who began the imagined snow tradition, composed what would become his most famous work. It was written during a warm February evening, with night insects chirping outside his window. No snow came this year, still I swept the veranda, left a clean place there. Sometimes what does not arrive deserves a welcome as well. That poem circulated far beyond the palace. Monks copied it into their sermon scrolls. Teachers recited it to children in mountain villages. Even generations later, it was used as a meditation on patience. Snow did not need to fall to be felt. In absence, its meaning deepened. It became...
Imagine waking up before dawn to the smell of wet clay and the low, pulsing sound of water against stone. You're not a farmer, nor a priest, nor a soldier. You are something more obscure, more essential. You are the nilometer clerk, the most boringly important job in Egypt. It is the 12th century CE. Egypt, once ruled by pharaohs and now under Fatimid influence, is a land still obsessed
with the same annual ritual, waiting for the Nile to rise. You, a mid-ranking scribe named Bayyumi ibn Sadid, are one of the only people allowed inside the sealed chamber that holds the sacred Nilometer, an ancient device embedded into the stone banks of the Nile on the island of Rauda in Cairo. Your job? Measure the flood, every day, at dawn, with a ruler. The Nilometer is a simple marvel, a graduated stone column rising out of a deep square pit connected to the Nile. Its markings are carved in cubits, a unit about the length of a forearm, and every cubit matters. Too few, and famine. Too many, and flood. You descend into the cool stone chamber, smell the river before you see it, and mark the water's progress. Today, it has risen a finger's width. You scratch the number into a tablet, then ascend. The sun isn't even up yet. A river of math and rice. Why such obsession? Because Egypt, for all its monuments and grand dynasties, has always been at the mercy of a single annual flood. The Nile's inundation is life and death. It waters the fields, delivers silt, and determines how much tax the state can collect. Too little floodwater and rice paddies dry. Too much, and whole fields drown. So Bayyumi doesn't just record water levels, he effectively writes the budget for the entire caliphate. The Ministry of Finance waits on your reports. So does the vizier. So do the local governors of Upper and Lower Egypt. Entire grain markets fluctuate based on the readings you jot down in the dim light, standing barefoot on cool flagstones. And yet, no one celebrates you. You are the background figure in an empire built on mud and paperwork. The flood festival that isn't for you. Outside, the city waits. Each year during the month of Thout, Cairo celebrates the Wafa el-Nil, the arrival of the floodwaters, with music, feasting, and a charmingly wasteful ritual. The symbolic marriage of the Nile to a wooden bride. A practice inherited and modified from earlier pagan times. They throw garlands into the river. Children wear blue. Merchants decorate their boats. Meanwhile, Bayyumi sits in the dusty scriptorium compiling flood charts from the last 30 years. He cross-references them with agricultural yields. His handwriting is steady, neat, and unthanked. But he takes pride in it. A certain quiet satisfaction comes from knowing that the world keeps turning because someone counted the water. The danger of a perfect flood. Ironically, a perfect flood, 16 cubits, no more, no less, is a rarity. In such years, the grain yields are high, the harvest is smooth, and taxes flow into state coffers without resistance. But this can cause problems. You see, if all goes too well, the vizier gets ambitious. Bayyumi remembers the year 1148, when the flood was so ideal that the caliph ordered the construction of a third garden palace across the river. The funds came from raised taxes. Bayyumi tried to warn them. An abundant year doesn't guarantee 2 in a row. But no one listens to a clerk. Especially not one with ink stains and mild social anxiety. The following year, a low flood, not a famine, but close. Grain prices doubled. That new garden palace stood empty for decades, slowly overtaken by ibises and jasmine vines. Reading water like a diary. To Bayyumi, the Nilometer is not just a measuring stick.
It's a living archive. Every rise and fall tells a story. He sees patterns. Years when the water hesitated. Years when it surged early. Years when it rose slowly like a thoughtful camel. Sometimes he swears he can hear the river thinking. There are superstitions, of course. Some believe the river has moods. Others say that an old hermit once predicted floods based on bird migrations and got it right 3 years running. But Bayumi prefers numbers. He prefers the record from 1121, when the water rose exactly 1.3 cubits every 3 days for a fortnight. A very polite flood, he wrote in the margin. What the water won't tell you. Still, there are limits to what the Nilometer reveals. It cannot still 16 cubits. Still lying. An invitation to dream. Now imagine yourself sitting with Bayumi one humid evening, poring over a ledger of water measurements. He traces the entries with a calloused finger, then looks up and asks, "What do you think the river is planning this year?" You look at the chart, the rise is late, the numbers are steady, but there's something else, some pattern you haven't seen before. The candle flickers. Somewhere the river shifts its weight in the dark, but how exactly was this sacred water measured? And what happened to the man who dared to challenge the readings one fateful year? There comes a time in every clerk's career when they must decide whether to follow the data or the expectations of those above them. For Bayumi ibn Sadid, the Nilometer clerk, that year came in 1157. A slight rise and a great panic. The early weeks of flood season were unusually cool. The Nile crept up like a tired old man, reaching only 12 cubits by mid-month. 12 cubits, a number that sent a chill through the Ministry of Finance. 13 was tolerable, 14 was good, 12 meant grain shortages, bread riots, and angry petitions from rural governors who needed more canal water than the river would give. Bayumi logged the number in his ledger with extra ink to ensure clarity. No one could say he fudged it. 12 cubits, not a finger more. But 2 days later, a proclamation arrived from the palace. The Nilometer has confirmed a prosperous rise of 14 cubits, it read. Praise be to the river's bounty. Tax assessments will proceed accordingly. Bayumi blinked twice, then checked his records. He double-checked the scale carved into the stone column. 12. Definitely 12. The man who challenged the river. It wasn't the first time the court had adjusted reality. In lean years, it helped calm the population. A higher number gave the illusion of order. Clerks like Bayumi usually let it pass. Their job was to record, not to resist. But this time the discrepancy was dangerous. Local granaries had barely enough surplus, farmers were already nervous, and now a 14-cubit reading meant inflated taxes, unfair quotas, and no government emergency rations. Bayumi felt a knot in his stomach. He could either correct the official report and risk offending the vizier, or remain silent and watch villagers starve quietly, believing they had failed to meet their expected yields. He chose something in between. He copied the original report of 12 cubits onto a palm leaf scroll and delivered it by hand to Sheikh Mubarak, a retired irrigation inspector known for his vast knowledge of flood history and his increasingly absent-minded mumbling.
Mubarak squinted at the scroll, sniffed the ink, and nodded. Yes, yes, the river's keeping secrets again. Bayumi wasn't sure if that was approval or just the old man talking to the river spirits again. Flood riots and the clerk's dilemma. A month later, the rumors began to spread. In Fayoum, canal farmers noticed that their water allotments were drying earlier than expected. In Beni Suef, merchants... Now, citizens whispered. The clerk says it was 12. The phrase became a soft chant in market stalls and prayer corners. Bayumi received no official reprimand, but his access to the Nilometer was suddenly restricted. A new assistant was assigned to him, a thin-lipped man who never smiled and who always smelled faintly of cedarwood and suspicion. His name was Jibril. Watching the water with Jibril. Jibril claimed to be a surveyor from the provincial office in Alexandria, but he carried no tools, only a fresh reed pen and a habit of staring too long. Together they measured the water. Together they recorded it, but only Jibril sent the numbers to the palace. Bayumi, demoted in function but not in spirit, began keeping his own quiet ledger, hidden behind the fourth shelf in the scriptorium, tucked behind a decoy volume on fish taxes under the Abbasids. Each entry was careful, each measurement checked twice, sometimes thrice. He even wrote small notes beside the numbers. 13 cubits, but only after 10 days of delay. Rain upstream suspected. Sea report from Nubian traders. Birdsong absent. Water feels still beneath. Jibril never noticed, or if he did, he never said. The ceremony that nearly broke him. In the late summer of 1158, the vizier held a public celebration on the Rauda Island terrace to mark what he claimed was the most promising flood in a decade. Courtiers arrived in gold-threaded linen. Musicians played by the colonnades. The caliph released a ceremonial lamp into the Nile, floating it downstream to carry the promise of wealth. Bayumi was present, tucked at the edge of the crowd, standing behind a barrel of ceremonial dates. He watched the lamp bob in place for several minutes before slowly circling back upstream, caught in an eddy. The river was not rising, it was hesitating. No one else seemed to notice. One final entry in the hidden ledger. Later that night, Bayumi returned to the Nilometer. He waited until the guards changed shifts, then crept down the slick stairs with an oil lamp and his backup measuring cord. He checked the water, still 12.9 cubits, nowhere near 16. He sat beside the shaft, the air cool and echoing, and wrote, "They will say it was 15.5. They will order higher levies. They will build a dam near Elephantine. They will be surprised when the river retreats again. But the river does not lie. Men do." He folded the page carefully, pressed it into the hidden ledger, and returned home. The Nilometer was never built to impress. Its stone steps were plain, its markings utilitarian. Its circular shaft lacked the grandeur of the pyramids or the poetry of minarets. And yet, for nearly 1,000 years, it held the ear of the most powerful men in Egypt. Bayumi ibn Sadid, once its quietest servant, had come to understand something his superiors never fully grasped. When the river spoke, it was never in numbers alone. The quiet that meant trouble. By the 1160s,
Bayumi had passed the age of most scribes. His beard, once thick and black, had thinned into silver threads. His ink-stained hands trembled slightly as he held the stylus, but his measurements were still precise. Always precise. Jibril, now chief overseer of seasonal water policy, no longer monitored him closely. There was no need. The river had been compliant. Each year the flood came, more or less as expected. The palace readings, true or not, were accepted without question. And then, one summer, it didn't come. Not a low flood, not a failed flood, no flood. The river paused, as if holding its breath. Bayumi stood at the Nilometer day after day and saw no rise. The markings stayed at 10 cubits, then dipped to 9, then hovered, uncertain. No scrolls were sent from the palace, no priests performed the usual hymns. Jibril vanished from the office. For the first time in living memory, the Nilometer's shaft stood empty of visitors. No children tossed stones to hear them echo. No merchants brought barley as tribute. Only Bayumi remained, kneeling beside the silent column, whispering the old numbers. The night, the column split. The drought worsened. Farmers abandoned fields. Fayum cracked like pottery. Bread prices rose, and riots followed. Still, no royal decree declared a national emergency. The court insisted on temporary dryness, citing minor fluctuations and seasonal irregularities. Bayumi, desperate to understand, searched his old ledgers. He opened the hidden log from 1157. He found Mubarak's notes. He cross-referenced reports from Nubian traders, from bird migrations, even from fishermen who had spoken of ghost currents in shallow channels. And on the 14th night of Abib, something happened. The stone shaft of the Nilometer echoed with a sound no clerk had ever recorded. A sharp crack. It wasn't the river, it was the tower. He described the river's color, thicker than honey, with sediment rising early. He described the wind, southeasterly, which never brings rain this late. He described the fish, tilapia, returning to shallow pools, confused, possibly nesting. His neighbors called it the old clerk's almanac. Farmers trusted him more than the government charts. He taught a few young apprentices how to take honest readings. Not many came. The work was dull, the pay uncertain, and the Nile moody. Still, Bayumi persevered, and one day, just as quietly as it had stalled, the flood returned. No trumpets, no proclamations, just a ripple past the 12-cubit mark at dawn, and the scent of wet reeds carried into town on the breeze. Bayumi passed away in his sleep in the year 1173. He was buried on a slope overlooking the Nile, wrapped in a reed mat at his own request. His hidden ledgers were discovered a century later by a scholar cataloguing temple tax records. Some of the pages were smudged with watermarks and delicate fingerprints. One page simply read, "The river flows, but men must learn to listen without asking it to lie." In time, newer tools replaced the Nilometer: canals, European barometers, satellite predictions in the distant future. The Rhoda Island Nilometer itself was preserved, eventually restored as a historical monument. Tourists would visit. Guides would point at the cubit marks and say, "Here, the Caliph once read the fate of Egypt." Few mentioned Bayumi. But once in a while, when the river flooded a little earlier than expected, or refused to rise despite all predictions,
Someone would shrug and murmur, "Maybe the river's telling the truth again." And no one would argue.